when a wealthy widow stepped down from her elegant carriage and offered a struggling rancher 500 acres of prime land in exchange for a single night in his home, the entire territory of Willow Ridge held its breath. Elias Carter stood on his worn porch, his young daughter clutching his hand, staring at the woman whose fortune could save everything he'd fought to protect. But Victoria Hale's eyes held something darker than charity, a desperation that wealth couldn't cure. What neither of them knew was that her late husband's empire had once destroyed the very ground beneath their feet. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you enjoy this journey, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't believe where this goes. The August sun burned white across the Wyoming territory, turning the valley into a shimmering furnace of dust and dying grass. Elias Carter stood at the edge of his property, one boot propped against the lowest rail of a fence that desperately needed replacing, watching the horizon with the patience of a man who'd learned to read trouble long before it arrived. Behind him, the ranch house stood weathered and defiant, a two-story structure of rough-hewn timber that had survived 15 winters but looked ready to surrender to the 16th. The barn listed slightly to the east, its roof patched with mismatched planks that testified to years of making do with what little remained. 3 horses grazed in the near pasture, their ribs showing through dull coats that spoke of sparse feed and hard times. This land had been in the Carter family for 2 generations, carved from wilderness by his grandfather's hands and watered with his father's sweat. Now it was slipping away like sand through Elias's fingers, acre by acre, season by season, claimed by debts and drought, and the relentless indifference of a frontier that rewarded only the strongest and the richest. Elias pulled his hat lower against the glare, his weathered face creased with lines that made him look older than his 34 years. His hands, calloused and scarred, rested on the fence rail with the unconscious ease of a man who'd spent his life working with them. He wore the same clothes he wore every day: faded denim trousers, a cotton shirt that had once been blue, boots that had been resoled 3 times, and wouldn't survive a 4th. "Papa?" He turned to find his daughter standing in the doorway of the house, her small frame silhouetted against the dim interior. Lily was 7 years old, with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gray eyes. She wore a simple dress that she'd already grown too tall for, the hem stopping well above her ankles. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Someone's coming." She pointed toward the eastern road where a dark shape had emerged from the heat shimmer. "A fancy carriage." Elias straightened, squinting at the approaching vehicle. Lily was right. It was fancy, fancier than anything that had business on this forgotten stretch of hard-scrabble ranch land. Black lacquered wood gleamed in the sunlight, pulled by a matched pair of horses that moved with the fluid grace of animals that had never known hunger or hard labor. Even from a distance, he could see the glint of brass fittings, the carefully maintained leather of the harness. "Go inside," he told Lily quietly. "But Papa—" "Inside, Lily. Stay there until I call for you." She hesitated, reading something in his voice that made her nod and slip back through the doorway. Elias watched her go, then turned back to face whatever was coming down his road. The carriage rolled to a stop 20 feet from the house, the matched horses tossing their heads and stamping in the dust. The driver, a man in livery too fine for the territory, set the brake and climbed down to open the passenger door. The woman who emerged didn't belong in Wyoming. That was Elias's first thought, sharp and certain as a knife blade. She wore a traveling dress of deep burgundy silk, the kind of garment that cost more than most families earned in a year. Her hat was pinned at a precise angle, adorned with feathers that probably came from birds Elias had never seen. Black gloves covered her hands. Her face, shaded by the hat's brim, showed the kind of composure that came from wealth and the certainty that wealth provided. She was beautiful in the way a painting was beautiful, something to be admired from a distance, untouchable, perfectly arranged. Maybe 40 years old, though it was hard to tell with women who had money enough to buy whatever lotions and potions kept time at bay. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice was cultured, Eastern, each word precisely enunciated. "Mr. Elias Carter?" "That's right." Elias stayed where he was, one boot still propped on the fence rail. "What can I do for you, ma'am?" She studied him for a long moment, her eyes traveling from his worn boots to his faded hat with an assessment that felt both clinical and searching. Then she glanced at the ranch house, the sagging barn, the thin horses in their dusty pasture. "My name is Victoria Hale," she said. "I own the Hale Mining Company, among other enterprises. Perhaps you've heard of it?" Everyone in the territory had heard of Hale Mining. It was one of the largest operations in Wyoming, with claims stretching across 3 counties. The kind of company that had its own town, its own store, its own rules. "I've heard of it," Elias said neutrally. Victoria Hale's lips curved in something that might have been a smile. "I've come to make you a proposition, Mr. Carter, one that I believe you'll find advantageous." She gestured toward the house. "May we speak inside? I've traveled some distance, and the heat is rather oppressive." Elias considered her for a moment, then pushed away from the fence. "Suit yourself." He led her across the dusty yard to the house, acutely aware of how everything must look through her eyes. The peeling paint, the cracked window pane he'd covered with oiled paper, the front steps that creaked under his weight. Inside was no better. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all at once. The furniture was rough-built and practical, the floor bare wood swept clean but scuffed by years of use. Lily stood in the corner, her eyes wide as she stared at the elegant stranger. Victoria's gaze found her immediately, and something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps, or recognition of something unexpected. "Your daughter?" "Yes, ma'am." "Lily, this is Mrs. Hale, my daughter, Lily." Lily bobbed an awkward curtsy, something she'd learned from a book because there was no one in their corner of the territory to teach her such things. Victoria inclined her head in acknowledgement, a gesture that held more genuine respect than Elias had expected. "How old are you, Lily?" "7, ma'am." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "A lovely age." Victoria's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "I had a daughter once. She would have been about your age." "Would have been." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications that Elias didn't want to explore. He cleared his throat. "You wanted to speak about a proposition, Mrs. Hale?" Victoria drew her gaze away from Lily, the softness fading from her face as quickly as it had appeared. "Yes. Let me be direct, Mr. Carter. I've made inquiries about you and your situation. I understand that you're facing significant financial difficulties. The bank holds mortgages on your property. You're behind on payments, and without a substantial influx of capital, you'll lose everything within 6 months." The word should have angered him, this stranger poking into his private affairs, cataloging his failures with such clinical precision. But Elias had spent too many sleepless nights staring at ledgers that wouldn't balance to feel anything but tired resignation. "Your sources are well informed," he said quietly. "I make it my business to be well informed." Victoria walked slowly around the room, her gloved fingers trailing along the back of a chair, pausing at the window to look out at the struggling ranch. "I also know that this land has been in your family for 2 generations, that you've worked it since you were barely older than your daughter, that you've refused multiple offers to sell, even when accepting would have been the prudent choice." She turned to face him. "Why is that, Mr. Carter? Why cling to something that's clearly failing?" Elias met her gaze steadily. "Because it's mine. Because my father died working this land, and my grandfather before him. Because some things matter more than prudence." "Even when that stubbornness costs your daughter her future?" The words hit like a physical blow. Elias felt his jaw tighten, saw Lily shift uncomfortably in her corner. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "My daughter has a future. Maybe not the one you'd recognize, but a future nonetheless. She knows the value of hard work, the meaning of family, the strength it takes to stand by your principles when everything else is falling apart. That's worth more than whatever money can buy." Victoria studied him with renewed interest. "Is it? Tell me, Mr. Carter, can your principles pay the bank? Can your hard work cure the drought that's killing your cattle? Can your family name put food on the table when winter comes?" "We manage." "You survive," Victoria corrected. "There's a difference. But I'm not here to debate philosophy. I'm here to offer you a solution. 500 acres of prime grazing land along the Snake River, deeded in your name, free and clear. Water rights included. Enough to expand your herd, pay off your debts, and build the kind of operation your grandfather dreamed of." The offer hung in the air between them, too good to be real, too perfect not to have a catch. Elias waited, knowing it would come. Victoria reached up and removed her hat, setting it carefully on the table. Without it, he could see her face fully for the first time. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else there. A weariness around the eyes, a tightness at the corners of her mouth that spoke of burdens carried too long. In exchange, she said quietly, I want to spend one night in your home. The words seemed to echo in the small room. Elias stared at her, certain he must have misheard. I'm sorry, what? One night, Victoria repeated. I want to stay here, in this house, for a single night. Dinner with you and your daughter, a night's rest under your roof, breakfast in the morning. Then I leave, and the land is yours. The deed will be drawn up by my attorneys and ready for your signature. Elias felt the world tilt slightly, nothing quite making sense. You're offering me 500 acres of prime land worth thousands of dollars in exchange for what exactly? A place to sleep? For a night in a home, Victoria said, and there was something raw in her voice now, the polished composure cracking just enough to let something human show through. Not a mansion, not a hotel. A home, Mr. Carter, with a family, with laughter and warmth and all the simple things that I... She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. When she continued, her voice was carefully neutral again. I have my reasons. They're personal, and I'd prefer not to discuss them. You have my offer. It's genuine, legally binding, and more generous than you'll ever receive from anyone else. Do you accept? Elias looked at his daughter, saw the confusion and hope warring on her young face. 500 acres, water rights, freedom from the debts that choked him a little more each day. Security for Lily, a future for the ranch, everything he'd been fighting for, all for a single night. Every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Women like Victoria Hale didn't make offers like this without hidden motives, without strings attached that wouldn't become visible until too late. She could buy anything she wanted. Why come to a failing ranch in the middle of nowhere? Why offer a fortune for something she could have for a few dollars at any boarding house in the territory? Why me? He asked. Why this house? There are 1,000 places you could stay, 1,000 families that would welcome you. Why come here? Victoria's eyes met his, and for just a moment, he saw past all the carefully maintained barriers to something desperate and lost. Because I heard that you lost your wife 3 years ago, she said quietly, that you've raised your daughter alone ever since, working this ranch and never complaining, never asking for help, never giving up even when any sensible person would have walked away. Because people in town speak of you as a man of integrity, someone who keeps his word even when it costs him. Because I thought that perhaps, in a house like this, with a man like you, she trailed off, looking away. I thought I might remember what it feels like to be human. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel and the distant cry of a hawk somewhere in the burning sky. Lily moved first, stepping forward from her corner with the unconscious bravery of children who haven't yet learned to be cynical. Are you sad? She asked Victoria. The woman looked down at her, something shifting in her carefully composed face. Yes, she whispered. I'm very sad. Papa says that when you're sad, it helps to have someone to talk to. And to have a warm meal. We don't have much, but Papa makes good stew, and I can show you my drawings if you want. Victoria's eyes glistened suddenly, tears threatening to spill over. She blinked rapidly, regaining control, but not before Elias saw the naked grief that flickered across her features. He made his decision. No, he said firmly. Victoria's head snapped up. I'm sorry? I said no. I won't accept your offer, not the way you've presented it. He saw the hope drain from her face, replaced by resignation and something that looked like embarrassment. She reached for her hat. I see. I apologize for wasting your time, Mr. Carter. I'm not finished, Elias interrupted. I won't accept payment for hospitality. I won't sell a night in my home like it's a transaction at the general store. If you're sad, if you need a place to stay, if you want to remember what it feels like to be human, then you're welcome here as a guest. No payment, no land, no deals. Victoria froze, staring at him as if he'd spoken in a language she didn't understand. You're refusing 500 acres? I'm refusing to sell something that shouldn't be for sale. But the offer to stay stands, if you want it. Dinner tonight, a bed for the night, breakfast in the morning, Simple as that. But you need the land. You need what I need, Elias said quietly, and what I'm willing to trade for it are two different things. My home isn't for sale, Mrs. Hale, but my door's open to anyone who needs it, rich or poor. That's how I was raised, and that's how I'm raising my daughter. He saw something crack in Victoria's composure, the carefully maintained walls crumbling just a little further. She looked from him to Lily and back again, searching for the trap, the angle, the hidden cost that had to exist somewhere in such an offer. Why would you do this? Her voice was barely audible. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. No, ma'am, I don't. But you came here looking for something you can't buy with all your money and all your land. Maybe that's reason enough. Victoria stood silent for a long moment, her gloved hands trembling slightly. Then, very slowly, she removed the gloves, one finger at a time, revealing hands that were softer and paler than any that belonged on a working ranch. I accept, she whispered. And thank you. Lily clapped her hands together, delighted. Can I show you my room? Papa built me a whole shelf for my treasures. I'd like that very much, Victoria said, and this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. As Lily led the elegant stranger toward the narrow staircase, chattering about her collection of interesting rocks and the bird's nest she'd found last spring, Elias watched them go with a mixture of unease and certainty. He'd just turned down a fortune based on nothing more than instinct and principle, and he had no idea if he'd made the right choice. But as he heard Lily's delighted laughter floating down from upstairs, followed by Victoria's softer, wondering response, he thought that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth more than land. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, painting the worn floorboards with bars of golden light. Outside, the ranch continued its slow surrender to drought and debt. But inside, for the first time in 3 years, the house felt less empty. Elias went to the kitchen and began pulling ingredients for dinner, his hands moving through familiar motions while his mind wrestled with what he'd just done. The rational part of him, the part that lay awake at night calculating how many months they could last, how much they could sell, how far they could stretch each dollar, was screaming that he was a fool. 500 acres, water rights, security, gone. But the other part, the part that remembered his father's lessons about integrity and his mother's insistence that hospitality was sacred, felt something else, something that might have been peace. He heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to find Victoria standing in the doorway. She'd removed her elegant traveling jacket, and without it she looked smaller, less imposing, more human. Your daughter is remarkable, she said. She showed me her treasures, mostly rocks and feathers, but she described each one like it was precious as diamonds. She told me the story behind every item, where she found it, what she imagined it meant. It was what? Elias prompted when she trailed off. Beautiful, Victoria finished quietly. She sees magic in ordinary things. I'd forgotten that was possible. Elias returned to chopping vegetables for the stew. Lily's mother was like that, could find wonder in a sunset or a wildflower, or the way ice formed on the creek in winter. She taught Lily to look at the world that way before she passed. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. He paused, then added, 3 years now. Some days it feels like yesterday. Other days it feels like another lifetime. Victoria moved further into the room, her eyes taking in the simple kitchen with its cast-iron stove, rough wooden counters, and collection of mismatched dishes. May I help? Elias glanced at her expensive dress, her soft hands. You don't have to. I'd like to, if you'll show me what to do. There was something almost pleading in her tone, a desire to be useful that transcended her obvious unfamiliarity with kitchen work. Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, you can peel these potatoes. Knife's there. Bowls for the peelings. Victoria took the knife gingerly, holding it like an unfamiliar tool. Her first attempts were clumsy, wasting as much potato as she peeled, but she persevered with a determination that surprised him. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of the knife and the distant thump of Lily moving around upstairs. I meant what I said earlier, Victoria said suddenly, about your reputation. People in town speak highly of you. They say you're honest, hardworking, that you'd give a stranger your last dollar if they needed it. Elias shrugged. Frontier's hard enough without people being stingy with each other. And yet it's full of people who are exactly that: stingy, greedy, willing to step on anyone to get ahead. She paused in her peeling. My late husband was one of them. The words hung in the air. Elias kept his attention on the vegetables he was chopping, giving her space to continue if she wanted. Charles Hale, Victoria said quietly. Perhaps you knew the name before you knew mine. He built an empire on the backs of other people's suffering. Mines, railroads, timber. He took and took and took, and never once asked if it was right. Never once considered the families he displaced, the communities he destroyed, the lives he ruined. Her hand stilled on the potato. I was his wife. I wore the gowns he bought, lived in the mansions he built, spent the money he made. I told myself I didn't know how he acquired it all, but that was a lie. I knew. I just didn't want to see. Elias heard the raw pain in her voice, the self-loathing that dripped from every word. People do what they have to do to survive, he said carefully. Do they? Victoria looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Or do they tell themselves that to excuse their cowardice? I could have left. I could have spoken up. I could have done something other than play the elegant wife, hosting parties and making small talk while my husband crushed people beneath his heel. Why didn't you? The question came out more bluntly than Elias intended, but Victoria didn't flinch from it. Because I was comfortable, she said simply. Because I liked the pretty dresses and the fine houses and never having to worry about money. Because it was easier to look away than to face what I'd become complicit in. She set down the knife, potato forgotten. And then one day Charles died. Heart failure, sudden and final. And I inherited everything. The mines, the companies, the fortune, all of it. That's when things changed? No. Victoria's laugh was bitter. That's when I realized nothing had changed at all. I was still surrounded by wealth, still living in luxury, still insulated from every hardship. But now there was no one else to blame for it. No husband to hide behind. Just me and all the money that had been built on other people's pain. She picked up the knife again, her movements mechanical. I tried to be better. I improved working conditions at the mines, raised wages, invested in the communities around my holdings. But it felt like putting bandages on wounds I'd helped create. Like trying to buy forgiveness with the same money that was the problem in the first place. Lily's footsteps thundered down the stairs, and Victoria quickly wiped her eyes, composing herself. The little girl burst into the kitchen, her face flushed with excitement. Papa, can Mrs. Hale sit next to me at dinner? I want to tell her about the coyote family that lives in the north pasture. If Mrs. Hale wants to, sweetheart. I'd be honored, Victoria said, and the warmth in her voice was genuine. Dinner that evening was simple: venison stew with vegetables, fresh bread that Elias had baked that morning, water from the well. They ate at the rough wooden table, Lily chattering between bites about everything from the coyotes to the patterns she'd seen in the clouds, to the story she was writing about a princess who lived in a barn and was friends with all the horses. Victoria listened with an attention that seemed almost desperate, asking questions, laughing at Lily's jokes, engaging with the little girl's rambling stories as if they were the most important thing in the world. Watching them, Elias felt something in his chest loosen slightly. After dinner, Lily insisted on showing Victoria how to wash dishes the proper way, which involved more splashing than actual cleaning. The kitchen filled with laughter as Lily demonstrated her technique, soap suds flying everywhere. Victoria's expensive dress got splattered, but she didn't seem to care, too caught up in the simple joy of playing in dishwater with a 7-year-old. When the dishes were done and Lily had been sent to get ready for bed, Victoria and Elias sat on the front porch as the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Thank you, Victoria said quietly. For what? For this, for treating me like a person instead of a fortune, for letting me pretend just for a few hours that I'm someone who belongs in a place like this. Elias leaned back in his chair, watching the last light fade from the sky. You hungry for something you can't buy? Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. I'm surrounded by people every day, servants, business associates, social acquaintances, but I haven't had a real conversation in years, haven't laughed genuinely, haven't felt connected to another human being. Everything is transaction, obligation, performance. Sounds lonely. It's profoundly lonely. Victoria hugged herself despite the warm evening. I thought if I could just spend one night in a real home, with real people living real lives, maybe I could remember what that felt like, what it meant to be part of something instead of always standing outside looking in. Before Elias could respond, Lily appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, her hair still damp from washing. Papa, I'm ready for bed. Will you tell the story about the stars? Of course I will, sweetheart. Say goodnight to Mrs. Hale. Lily crossed to Victoria and, with the unself-conscious affection of childhood, threw her arms around the woman's neck. Good night, Mrs. Hale. I'm glad you came to visit. Victoria's arms came up slowly, carefully, as if she'd forgotten how to return such a simple gesture. Good night, Lily. Thank you for sharing your treasures with me. After Lily had gone upstairs with her father, Victoria sat alone on the porch as darkness settled over the valley. She could hear Elias's voice drifting through the open window, low and warm, as he told his daughter a story about how the stars got in the sky. Lily's occasional questions and delighted responses punctuated the tale. This, Victoria thought, this is what I've been missing, not the simplicity of the house or the roughness of the furniture, not even the absence of wealth and its trappings, but this sense of belonging, of being part of something that mattered not because it was profitable or powerful, but because it was real. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache there. Grief for all the years wasted, all the chances missed, all the connections she'd failed to make because she'd been too comfortable in her isolation. When Elias returned, he found her staring out at the darkness with tears running silently down her face. Mrs. Hale? She wiped her eyes quickly. I'm sorry, I'm being foolish. Don't seem foolish to me. He settled back into his chair. Seems like you're feeling something real, maybe for the first time in a while. Is it always like this? Victoria asked. This sense of peace, of rightness? Elias considered the question. No, he said honestly. Most days are hard work and worry and trying to stretch too little too far. But there are moments when Lily laughs at something silly, or when the work goes well, or when I stand on the ridge and watch the sun come up over the valley, when I remember why it matters, why all the struggle is worth it. I can't remember the last time I felt like anything mattered, Victoria whispered. Everything I do, everyone I know, it all feels empty, hollow, like I'm going through the motions of life without actually living. Maybe, Elias said gently, it's because you've spent so long trying to fill the emptiness with things instead of people. I don't know how to do anything else. I don't know how to connect with people anymore. Every relationship I have is colored by money, what I can give them, what they want from me. No one sees me. They see Victoria Hale, the wealthy widow, the business owner, not the person underneath. I see a person, Elias said. Saw one from the moment you stepped out of that fancy carriage. Someone hurting, someone searching for something she's lost. Maybe never had. Victoria turned to look at him, this rough-hewn rancher, with his worn clothes and calloused hands and quiet wisdom. How do you do it? Live with such certainty, such peace, when everything around you is falling apart. Who says I'm at peace? Elias smiled sadly. I lie awake most nights worrying about money, about Lily's future, about whether I'm doing right by her. But then morning comes, and she's there with her smile and her stories, and I remember that whatever else happens, she's what matters. As long as I can give her love and teach her right from wrong, the rest is just details. Just details, Victoria repeated. A fortune in land would be just details to you? In the end, yeah, probably. Can't take it with you when you go. Can't buy your way into heaven or hell. All that's left is how you treated people, what you stood for, whether you lived with integrity or convenience. They sat in comfortable silence as night deepened around them. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. The stars emerged one by one, vast and brilliant in the clear frontier sky. I should retire, Victoria said eventually. You've been more than generous with your time. Guest room's upstairs, second door on the right. It's not fancy, but the bed's clean and comfortable. Victoria stood, then hesitated. Mr. Carter, Elias, if I may, thank you. Not for the room or the meal, but for reminding me that there's still kindness in the world, that there are still people who choose principle over profit. Get some rest, Mrs. Hale. Things always look different in the morning light. As she turned to go inside, Victoria paused once more. The land offer still stands, you know. Even if you won't accept it as payment, I could still deed it to you, no strings attached. Consider it a gift rather than a transaction. Elias shook his head. Gifts that big come with obligations whether you intend them or not. I appreciate the thought, but I'll manage on my own. Victoria smiled sadly and went inside, leaving Elias alone with the darkness and the stars, and the weight of a decision that had cost him everything and nothing at all. Dawn broke cool and clear over the valley, the air carrying that peculiar freshness that came just before summer's full heat descended. Elias had been awake for an hour already, moving quietly through the morning chores so as not to disturb his guest. He'd fed the horses, collected eggs from the henhouse, and was just returning to the kitchen when he heard footsteps on the stairs. Victoria appeared in the doorway wearing the same dress from yesterday, though she'd clearly done her best to freshen up. Her hair was pinned more simply than before, and without the elaborate hat and gloves, she looked younger, less formidable. She paused when she saw him, something uncertain in her expression. "Good morning," she said. "I hope I didn't sleep too late." "Not at all. Coffee's ready if you want some." She moved into the kitchen with visible relief, as if she'd been worried about intruding. Elias poured her a cup and watched as she wrapped her hands around it, breathing in the steam. "I can't remember the last time I slept so well," Victoria said quietly. No sounds of carriages in the street, no servants moving through the halls, just silence and the wind. "Takes some getting used to if you're not accustomed to it. Some people find it too quiet." "I found it perfect." She took a sip, then looked at him over the rim of the cup. "I've been thinking about our conversation last night, about what you said regarding things and people." Before Elias could respond, Lily came tumbling down the stairs, still in her nightgown, her hair wild from sleep. She stopped short when she saw Victoria, suddenly shy. "Good morning, Lily," Victoria said warmly. "Did you sleep well?" "Yes, ma'am." Lily edged closer to her father. "Are you staying for breakfast?" "If your father will have me." "Of course she is," Elias said, ruffling his daughter's hair. "Why don't you go get dressed, sweetheart? Then you can help me with the pancakes." Lily scampered back upstairs, and Victoria smiled. "She's wonderful, so full of life and curiosity. You've done well with her." "She makes it easy, takes after her mother that way, finds joy in simple things, doesn't need much to be happy." Elias began pulling out ingredients for breakfast. Her mother used to say that Lily was born smiling, came into the world looking for the next adventure. "Tell me about her," Victoria said. "Your wife, I mean, if it's not too painful." Elias was quiet for a moment, measuring flour into a bowl. "Sarah," he said finally. "Her name was Sarah. We met when we were both 16. Her father's wagon train stopped here for supplies, and I spent 3 days trying to work up the courage to talk to her. Finally did on the last day, right before they were set to leave." "What did you say?" "Asked if she liked horses." He smiled at the memory. "Dumbest thing I could have come up with, but she laughed and said yes, and somehow we ended up talking for 2 hours. Her father had to send someone to find her." Victoria settled into a chair at the table, cradling her coffee. "She stayed?" "Not right away. They moved on, heading for California. But we wrote letters. Took months for them to reach each other, but we wrote anyway. 2 years of letters before she convinced her parents to let her come back, let her marry a rancher's son with more dreams than money. She must have loved you very much. We loved each other." Elias cracked eggs into the bowl, his movements automatic. "Wasn't always easy, ranch life never is, but we had 8 good years before the fever took her. 8 years of laughter and arguments and making plans. 8 years of building a life together." He looked up and found Victoria watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to bend your ear with old stories." "Please don't apologize. I asked because I wanted to know. Because it's clear that whatever else has been hard in your life, you had something real, something that mattered." "Everyone's got something that matters to them." "Do they?" Victoria's voice had gone quiet again. "I was married to Charles for 15 years, and I'm not sure we ever had what you're describing. We had an arrangement, a partnership of convenience. His money, my family's social standing. We lived parallel lives that occasionally intersected at dinner parties and business functions." Lily returned properly dressed now, and the conversation shifted to lighter things. Breakfast became a cheerful affair, with Lily insisting on showing Victoria how to flip pancakes, a demonstration that resulted in one pancake on the floor and both of them dissolving into giggles. Elias watched them from across the kitchen, something warm settling in his chest at the sight of his daughter's delight. After breakfast, as Elias began clearing dishes, Victoria stood abruptly. "I'd like to see your land," she said. "The ranch, I mean. Would you show me?" Elias glanced at her expensive dress, her impractical shoes. "It's not fancy walking, rough ground, lots of dust." "I don't care about the dust, please. I'd like to understand what you're fighting for." Something in her tone made him nod. "Lily, you stay here and practice your letters like we talked about. Mrs. Hale and I are going to walk the property. Can I come?" "Not this time, sweetheart, but maybe later we can all go see the coyote den if Mrs. Hale is interested." Lily's eyes lit up. "Really? You promise?" "I promise." They set out across the ranch, Victoria doing her best to navigate the uneven ground in her inadequate footwear. Elias kept his pace slow, leading her past the barn and corrals, through the near pastures where the few remaining cattle grazed on sparse grass. "This was all green once," he said, gesturing at the dry landscape. "When I was Lily's age, this valley was the prettiest piece of country you ever saw. Grass up to a horse's belly, wildflowers everywhere, creeks running clear and cold from the mountains." "What happened?" "Drought, mostly. 3 years of it now, getting worse each season. The big ranchers upstream dammed the waterways, redirected them to their own spreads. By the time what's left reaches down here, it's barely enough to keep things alive." He pointed toward the distant mountains. "See that tree line? That's where our original property ended. 2,000 acres my grandfather claimed. We've sold off most of it over the years, piece by piece, trying to keep what's left running." Victoria looked around at the struggling land, the dying grass, the cattle that were too thin despite Elias's obvious care. "How much is left?" 300 acres. Not enough to support a proper herd, not without more water, but enough to call home, enough to keep fighting for." They walked in silence for a while, climbing gradually toward higher ground. Victoria stumbled occasionally on the rough terrain, and once Elias had to catch her elbow to keep her from falling. She murmured thanks, but didn't pull away immediately, and they continued with his hand loosely supporting her arm. "Your offer yesterday," Elias said finally, "the 500 acres with water rights. That's Hale Company land, isn't it?" "Yes, prime grazing land along the Snake River, never developed. Charles acquired it years ago with plans to sell it for profit, but never got around to it. It's just sitting there, unused. And you were going to give it to me for a night's hospitality." Victoria's jaw tightened. "I was going to give it to you because I'm desperate and foolish and thought I could buy something that can't be bought. Because I have more land and money than I could use in 10 lifetimes, and none of it means anything. Because last night, sitting at your table with you and Lily, I felt more human than I have in years, and I would have given anything to hold on to that feeling a little longer." Elias stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "You can't buy your way out of loneliness, Mrs. Hale. Doesn't work that way." "I know that now." She looked away, blinking hard. "I think part of me knew it all along, but when you spend enough time surrounded by people who only care about what you can give them, you start to believe that's all relationships are. Transactions, exchanges of value. That's not what relationships are." "No," she agreed quietly. "It's not. But it's all I've known for so long that I'd forgotten there was another way." They had reached a ridge now, the highest point on what remained of the Carter property. Below them, the valley stretched out in all its harsh beauty. The struggling ranch, the distant town, the mountains rising purple against the morning sky. Elias stood looking out over it, his expression distant. "My grandfather used to bring me up here," he said. "Told me that this land was worth fighting for, not because of what we could take from it, but because of what it gave us. A place to belong. Room to grow. Freedom to live according to our own principles, not someone else's rules." "Do you still believe that?" "Most days. Some days it's harder." He turned to her. "You asked me last night how I live with such certainty. Truth is, I don't. I'm scared most of the time. Scared I'll lose this place. Scared I won't be able to provide for Lily. Scared that I'm being stubborn about something that's already lost. But then I think about giving up, about walking away, and it feels like betraying everyone who worked this land before me, like saying their struggles didn't matter. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her eyes on the valley below. "The land I offered you," she said finally. "It belonged to a community once. A settlement called Willow Ridge." Elias went very still. "What did you say?" "Willow Ridge. It was a small farming community, about 50 families. They'd been there for 20 years when Charles decided he wanted the land. He used legal maneuvers, financial pressure, every trick he knew to force them out. Within 2 years, the entire settlement was gone. He bought it all for a fraction of what it was worth, planning to develop it for profit. The name hung between them like a physical thing. Willow Ridge. Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. When was this? His voice sounded strange to his own ears. 10 years ago? Maybe 12? Why? Elias turned away from her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. My grandfather's family came from Willow Ridge. Small farming community in the river valley, good land, good people. They lost everything when some mining magnate decided he wanted their property. My grandfather was one of the few who managed to move on, start over, but it broke him. He died bitter, talking about the injustice of it all. He heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath behind him. Oh no, please tell me, what was your grandfather's name?" "Thomas Carter. He had a farm on the eastern edge of the settlement, raised wheat and kept a small herd of dairy cows." The silence that followed was absolute. Elias could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears. He turned slowly to find Victoria with both hands pressed to her mouth, her face white as paper. "I killed him," she whispered. Not directly, but my husband destroyed his home, his livelihood, and I knew. I knew about Willow Ridge. I was there when Charles celebrated acquiring the land, when he talked about how cheaply he'd gotten it, how easily the farmers had folded. I smiled and raised my glass, and never once asked what happened to those families. "Mrs. Hale, don't." She stepped back from him, shaking her head violently. "Don't make excuses for me. I sat in my comfortable house wearing my expensive dresses while my husband destroyed your family, while he broke your grandfather's spirit and stole his home. And I did nothing." Elias felt a storm of emotions warring in his chest. Anger, grief, a terrible sense of cosmic irony. Of all the people who could have come to his door with an offer of land, it had to be her, the wife of the man who'd destroyed his grandfather's life. "Did you know?" he asked quietly. "When you came here yesterday, did you know who I was?" "No!" The word came out desperate. "I swear to you, I had no idea. I knew your name was Carter, but it's a common enough name. I never connected it to Willow Ridge, never thought—" She broke off, wrapping her arms around herself. "But that doesn't matter, does it? Whether I knew or not, the guilt is the same, the damage is the same." She turned away from him, her shoulders shaking. "I should leave. I should have left the moment you told me. I shouldn't have stayed, shouldn't have let Lily get attached, shouldn't have—" "Stop." Elias's voice cut through her spiral. "Just stop for a minute." Victoria fell silent, but didn't turn around. Elias could see her trembling, could hear the barely suppressed sobs catching in her throat. He thought about his grandfather, about the old man's bitter stories of a lost home. Thought about all the suffering that had come from one man's greed and another woman's willful blindness. And then he thought about the woman who'd sat at his table last night, laughing with his daughter, who'd washed dishes with tears in her eyes because she'd forgotten what simple connection felt like, who'd offered him a fortune not out of condescension, but out of desperate loneliness. "What's done is done," he said finally. "The past is the past. Can't change it, can't undo it. Question is what we do now." "How can you even look at me?" Victoria's voice was raw with self-loathing. "How can you stand there so calmly when I just told you that my family destroyed yours? Because you're not your husband. You're not the choices he made or the damage he caused. You were complicit, yes. You admitted as much last night. But you're here now trying to be better. That counts for something." "It doesn't count for enough." She whirled to face him, her careful composure completely shattered. "Don't you understand? I can't make this right. I can't undo what Charles did to Willow Ridge, can't bring back your grandfather's farm, can't restore what was taken. All the money in the world won't fix this." "No," Elias agreed. It won't. But maybe that's not the point. Victoria stared at him, confusion cutting through the grief on her face. What? The land you offered me. The 500 acres with water rights. That's Willow Ridge land, isn't it? The property your husband stole? Yes. Then give it back. The words hung in the morning air. Victoria's eyes widened. What? Not to me, Elias clarified. To the community. To the people it was taken from, or their descendants. Use it to rebuild what was destroyed. Make it right, not by paying off your guilt, but by actually fixing the damage. Victoria was shaking her head before he finished. It's been too long. The people are scattered, moved on. Most of them probably don't even remember. They remember, Elias interrupted. Believe me, they remember. People don't forget losing their homes. My grandfather told those stories until the day he died, and I'll bet every other family that was driven out did the same. They remember and their children remember. And given the chance, some of them would come back. He moved closer to her, his voice intense. You said last night that you tried to be better after your husband died. Improved conditions, raised wages, threw money at problems. But it felt empty because you were still just buying things, still treating people like transactions. This could be different. This could be about restoration, about justice, about giving back what was taken. I don't know how, Victoria whispered. I don't know how to do what you're describing. Neither do I, Elias admitted, but we could figure it out. Together. The word hung between them, full of implications and possibilities. Victoria searched his face, looking for anger or condemnation or hidden motives. Finding none of those things seemed to shake her more than if she had. Why would you help me? She asked. Why would you want anything to do with me after what I've told you? Because my grandfather used to say that the opposite of injustice isn't revenge, it's restoration. Because holding on to anger won't bring back what was lost, but building something new might honor it. Because, he paused, choosing his words carefully. Because I think you came to my door looking for redemption, and maybe this is how you find it. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not, Elias said honestly. But forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. If it was, nobody would ever get it. It's about choosing not to let the past poison the future. About believing people can change, can be better than they were. Victoria pressed her hands to her face, and this time the sobs came freely. Elias stood awkwardly, unsure what to do, until finally he stepped forward and rested a hand on her shoulder. She turned into the gesture, and suddenly she was crying against his chest, great heaving sobs that seemed to tear out of her like something physical. He held her stiffly at first, uncomfortable with such raw emotion from a woman he barely knew, but gradually his arms came around her properly, offering the same comfort he'd give to anyone in pain. They stood that way for several minutes, Victoria crying out years of guilt and grief, while Elias simply held her, his eyes on the valley below. When she finally pulled back, her face was blotchy and tear-stained, all pretense of elegant composure abandoned. I'm sorry, she managed. I'm so sorry. I know. If I do this, if I try to rebuild Willow Ridge, will you help me? I don't know the first thing about farming communities or what people need or how to make it work, but you do. Your family came from there. You understand what was lost. Elias considered the question, thinking about all the implications. The time it would take, the complications it would create, the risk of tying his struggling ranch to this wealthy woman's redemption project. The rational part of him said to walk away, to let her solve her own problems while he focused on survival. But then he thought about his grandfather, about all the bitter old man's stories of what Willow Ridge had been before it was destroyed, about community and belonging and the kind of life that was possible when people worked together instead of against each other. On one condition, he said finally, anything. We do this right. No throwing money at the problem and hoping it fixes itself. We find the families that were displaced or their descendants. We ask them what they need, what they want. We build something that actually serves people, not something that makes you feel better about the past. Victoria nodded vigorously. Yes, that's exactly what I want. What I need. And another thing. Elias held her gaze steadily. This doesn't fix what happened. doesn't make up for your husband's crimes or your complicity. The best we can hope for is creating something good from something bad. That's all. No grand absolution, no washing away the guilt, just doing better, going forward. I understand. Victoria straightened, wiping at her eyes. When do we start? First things first. We need to get back to the house before Lily sends out a search party. Then we need to start making lists, families to contact, resources needed, legal requirements. This isn't something we can rush into. They started back down the ridge, both lost in thought. Halfway down, Victoria spoke again. Your grandfather, Thomas Carter, what was he like? Elias smiled despite himself. Stubborn as a mule, terrible at backing down from an argument, loved to tell stories, especially ones about the old days. He'd go on for hours about Willow Ridge, the barn raisings, the harvest festivals, the way everyone looked after each other. He sounds wonderful. He was. Also bitter and angry and convinced the world was fundamentally unfair. Losing Willow Ridge did that to him. He managed to start over here, built this ranch from nothing. But he never really let go of what was taken. Died still talking about going back someday, reclaiming what was his. I'm so sorry. Victoria's voice was thick with fresh tears. I'm so sorry my husband did that to him. Me too, but maybe... Elias gestured at the valley around them. Maybe we can build something that would have made him proud. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something new. Something better. They reached the house to find Lily waiting anxiously on the porch, clearly worried about how long they'd been gone. She brightened when she saw them, then frowned in concern at Victoria's tear-stained face. Mrs. Hale, are you sad again? Victoria knelt down to Lily's level, managing a genuine smile. Yes, sweetheart, but it's the kind of sad that comes before getting better. Do you understand? Lily considered this seriously. Like when I fell and scraped my knee really bad? Papa said it had to hurt before it could heal. Exactly like that. Victoria reached out and gently touched Lily's cheek. You're a very wise little girl. Papa says that too, Lily beamed. Do you still want to see the coyote den? Papa promised. Victoria looked up at Elias, who nodded. If you're up for more walking. I am, though I might need to borrow more practical shoes if you have them. An hour later, they were tramping across the northern pasture, Lily leading the way with the confidence of someone who knew every inch of the property. Victoria wore a pair of Sarah's old boots. Too small and pinching, but better than her own impractical footwear, and had hiked up her skirts to keep them out of the dust. The coyote den was tucked into a rocky outcropping, hidden from casual view. Lily made them stop well back from it, putting a finger to her lips. We have to be quiet, she whispered. Mama Coyote has 3 babies. I've been watching them for weeks. They settled onto the ground, Victoria between Elias and Lily, and waited. The sun beat down warm on their backs. Grasshoppers clicked in the dry grass. Somewhere a bird called, lonely and distant. After 15 minutes, Lily tugged on Victoria's sleeve and pointed. 3 small coyote pups had emerged from the den, tumbling over each other in play. They were all ears and oversized paws, their movements clumsy and endearing. Victoria watched them with an expression of pure wonder, like someone seeing magic for the first time. One pup wandered closer to where they sat, sniffing the air curiously. Its mother appeared then, sleek and cautious, and shepherded her babies back toward the den with gentle nudges. They're beautiful, Victoria breathed. Lily named them, Elias said quietly. The biggest one is Thunder, the middle one is Sage, and the smallest is Whisper. Perfect names. Victoria smiled at Lily. How did you choose them? Thunder because he barks the loudest, Sage because that one likes to eat the sagebrush, and Whisper because she's the quiet one. Lily settled more comfortably against Victoria's side. Papa says they'll leave soon, go find their own territory, but I like watching them while they're still here. Me too, Victoria said softly. They stayed until the pups had retreated fully into the den and the mother had disappeared on her hunt. Walking back, Lily chattered about all the other animals she'd seen on the property. Rabbits and hawks, a bobcat once, deer that came down from the mountains in the early morning. Victoria listened with the same rapt attention she'd given everything else, asking questions, engaging fully with Lily's boundless enthusiasm. Watching them, Elias felt that strange warmth in his chest again, that sense of something shifting into place, Back at the house, Lily announced she was going to draw pictures of the coyote pups and disappeared upstairs with her precious paper and pencils. Elias and Victoria settled at the kitchen table with fresh coffee. "I should go," Victoria said, though she made no move to rise. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. Wasn't an imposition. Even after learning what my husband did, what I allowed, even then." Elias wrapped his hands around his cup. "You came here looking for something human. I'd say you found it. But more than that, maybe we found the start of something that could actually matter. A way to make the past mean something instead of just being weight we carry." Victoria nodded slowly. "I'll need to return to town, make arrangements, contact my lawyers, start the process of establishing a trust for the land, find records of who lived in Willow Ridge, track down their descendants." She looked up at him. "This will take time. Months, maybe years. Are you prepared for that?" "I've got nothing but time, and a strong motivation to see it through. Because of your grandfather. Partly, but also because—" He paused, considering his words. "Because Lily's growing up watching this. Whatever I do now, whatever choices I make, she's learning from them. I want her to see that when you have the chance to do something right, something meaningful, you take it, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." "You're a good father," Victoria said quietly. "A good man. I don't think you realize how rare that is." "I'm just doing what I can with what I've got." "That's what makes you rare." She stood, smoothing her rumpled dress. "I'll send word within the week, once I've spoken to my lawyers and begun the preliminary research. In the meantime, if you think of anyone who might have connections to Willow Ridge families, anyone who might know where they ended up, write down their names." "I will." They stood facing each other across the small kitchen, the weight of everything spoken and unspoken hanging between them. Finally, Victoria extended her hand. "Thank you, Elias, for your hospitality, your honesty, and your willingness to see past what I've been to what I'm trying to become." Elias took her hand, feeling the softness of it against his own calloused palm. "Thank you for reminding me that people can change, that it's never too late to try being better." Lily came clattering down the stairs with her drawings, insisting that Victoria take them as a reminder of the Coyote family. Victoria accepted them with tears in her eyes, promising to treasure them. At the carriage, the driver waiting patiently, Victoria turned for one last look at the struggling ranch and the man and child who'd shown her more genuine kindness than she'd known in years. "I'll be back," she promised. "This isn't goodbye." "No," Elias agreed, "it's not." They watched the elegant carriage roll away down the dusty road, Lily waving until it disappeared from sight. Then she looked up at her father with serious eyes. "Papa, is Mrs. Hale going to help us?" "In a way, we're going to help each other." "Is it because of the sad thing that made her cry?" Elias knelt down to Lily's level. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes people make mistakes or let bad things happen when they could have stopped them, and then they have to figure out how to make it right. Mrs. Hale wants to make something right, and we're going to help her do it." "Because that's what good people do?" "Because that's what good people do," Elias confirmed. Lily hugged him tight, her small arms fierce around his neck. Over her shoulder, Elias looked out at the struggling ranch, the dry valley, the endless sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust and possibility. The past couldn't be changed. His grandfather's farm wouldn't be restored. The years of bitterness wouldn't be erased. But maybe, just maybe, something new could be built. Something that honored what was lost while creating space for what could be. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was a start. 3 days passed before the telegram arrived. Elias was mending fence in the east pasture when he saw the rider approaching, a boy from the telegraph office in town bouncing along on a swayback mare. The sight made his stomach tighten. Telegrams rarely brought good news on the frontier. "Mr. Carter," the boy called out, waving a yellow envelope. "Got a wire for you from Cheyenne." Elias set down his tools and walked over, fishing a coin from his pocket. The boy handed over the telegram and wheeled his horse around, already halfway back to town before Elias had broken the seal. The message was brief, written in Victoria's precise hand, translated into telegraph shorthand. Records located, 23 families identified, 17 still in territory. Request meeting Friday, 2 o'clock at ranch. Bringing lawyer, Victoria Hale. Friday was 2 days away. Elias read the message twice more, feeling the reality of what they'd set in motion settling over him like a weight. This was actually happening. They were actually going to try to rebuild Willow Ridge. He found Lily in the kitchen when he returned, attempting to bake bread with more enthusiasm than skill. Flour dusted her hair and nose, and the dough looked suspiciously lumpy. "Mrs. Hale is coming back," he told her, holding up the telegram. "Friday afternoon. She's bringing a lawyer to talk about helping some people who lost their homes a long time ago." Lily's face lit up. "Can we make something special for her like Mama used to do when people visited?" The mention of Sarah sent a familiar pang through Elias's chest, but he smiled. "What did you have in mind?" "Mama's apple cake, the one with cinnamon. We still have some apples in the cellar, and I remember watching her make it." They spent the next hour working together, Lily consulting the stained recipe card in Sarah's handwriting, while Elias tried to interpret his late wife's abbreviated instructions. The result wasn't perfect. The cake came out slightly lopsided and darker on one side than the other, but the smell that filled the house was achingly familiar. "Mama would be proud," Elias said, ruffling Lily's flour-dusted hair. "You did good, sweetheart." "Do you think Mrs. Hale will like it?" "I think she'll love it." Thursday passed in a blur of preparations. Elias cleaned the house more thoroughly than he had in months, aware that Victoria would be bringing someone else, a lawyer, someone accustomed to fine things and proper surroundings. He knew it shouldn't matter, that the work they were planning was more important than appearances, but old pride made him scrub the floors until they shone and polish the few pieces of decent furniture they owned. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, Elias sat at the kitchen table with a lamp burning low and began writing down everything he could remember about Willow Ridge. His grandfather's stories had been vivid and detailed, and Elias had always been a good listener. He filled 3 pages with names and descriptions: the Johnsons, who'd run the general store, the Hernandez family with their 7 children and sprawling farm, old widow Morrison, who'd been the settlement's unofficial doctor, the Blackwood brothers, who'd operated the mill. Some of the families he knew had left the territory entirely, scattered east or west or south in search of new opportunities. But others he'd heard about over the years, pieces of gossip and casual mentions that he'd never paid much attention to before. The Johnson son who worked at the bank in Laramie, the youngest Hernandez girl who'd married a rancher near Casper, Marcus Blackwood, who'd ended up running a lumber operation in the mountains. By the time he set down his pen, the lamp oil was running low and his hand was cramping. But he had a list, a starting point. Tomorrow he'd give it to Victoria and they'd begin the work of finding these people, of asking them an impossible question. Would you come back? Would you return to the land that was stolen from you and help build something new? Friday dawned clear and hot, the kind of day where the air shimmered over the distant hills and even the birds seemed too exhausted to sing. Elias finished the morning chores early, then helped Lily into her best dress. A simple blue cotton that had been let out twice already and would need to be replaced soon, though he had no idea where the money for that would come from. They were both watching from the porch when the carriage appeared, the same elegant black vehicle that had first brought Victoria to their door. But this time there were 2 horses tied behind it, and when the driver opened the door, 2 people emerged instead of 1. Victoria wore another traveling dress, this one a deep forest green that made her look less severe than the burgundy had. Her companion was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with silver hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent time on the frontier despite his expensive suit. He carried a leather satchel that looked heavy with documents. "Elias," Victoria called out, her voice warm despite the formal circumstances. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us. This is Henry Morrison, my attorney." Henry, Elias Carter, and his daughter Lily. Morrison extended his hand, and Elias shook it, noting the firm grip and the direct gaze. "Mr. Carter, I've heard a great deal about you. Nothing too damaging, I hope." "On the contrary, Mrs. Hale speaks very highly of your character and judgment. She says you're the key to making this entire venture work." They moved inside, Lily darting ahead to make sure everything was perfect. She'd arranged wildflowers in a jar on the table and set out the slightly lopsided apple cake with obvious pride. Victoria noticed immediately, her face softening. "Did you make this, Lily?" "Papa helped, but I did most of it. It's Mama's recipe." "It looks wonderful. Victoria glanced at Elias, and he saw understanding in her eyes. The recognition of what it meant to share something so personal, so connected to Sarah's memory. They settled around the table, Morrison pulling documents from his satchel with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Hale has briefed me on the situation," he began, his voice crisp and professional.
The Willow Ridge acquisition, the displacement of the farming families, and her desire to make restitution through the establishment of a trust for the land. I've spent the past 3 days reviewing property records and legal precedents. He spread several papers across the table. The good news is that it's absolutely feasible from a legal standpoint.
Mrs. Hale owns the land outright, free and clear. She can establish a charitable trust with whatever terms she deems appropriate. The challenging part will be identifying rightful claimants and establishing a fair process for distribution. "I made a list," Elias said, pulling out his own pages. "Families I remember my grandfather talking about. Some are still in the territory." Morrison took the pages, his eyes scanning the names. "This is excellent. Very thorough. How confident are you in the accuracy?" "Pretty confident. My grandfather told the same stories dozens of times. He had a good memory for details." "What about proof of original ownership?" Morrison asked. "Land deeds, tax records, anything that would establish these families' claims to specific parcels?" Elias shook his head. "Most of that was lost when they were forced out, or bought for pennies on the dollar by—" He stopped, glancing at Victoria. "By my husband," she finished quietly. "You don't need to soften it, Elias. Henry knows everything." Morrison nodded. "Which brings us to a delicate point. Legally, everything Charles Hale did was above board. Ruthless and morally questionable, certainly, but within the bounds of territorial law. These families have no legal claim to restitution. Then why are we here?" Elias felt anger stirring in his chest. "Because legal obligation and moral obligation aren't the same thing," Victoria said firmly. "I know I can't be forced to return this land, but I should return it. It's the right thing to do." Morrison smiled slightly. "Which is exactly what I told her when she first proposed this, and why I agreed to help. The law serves justice imperfectly at best. Sometimes doing what's right requires going beyond what's required." He pulled out another document, this one covered in dense legal text. "I've drafted a preliminary trust agreement. The basics are simple. 500 acres of prime land along the Snake River, held in trust for the benefit of families displaced from the original Willow Ridge settlement. The trust will be administered by a board consisting of Mrs. Hale, yourself, and 3 representatives chosen by the returning families." Elias stared at him. "You want me on the board?" "Mrs. Hale insists," Morrison said, "and I agree with her reasoning. You have a personal connection to Willow Ridge through your grandfather. You understand ranching and farming. You're trusted in the local community. Most importantly, you have no financial stake in the outcome, which gives you the independence needed to make fair decisions." "I don't know anything about running a trust or managing that kind of project." "You'll learn," Victoria said. "We all will. That's part of the point. This isn't about imposing some grand vision from above. It's about working together to build something that actually serves the people it's meant to help." Lily had been listening quietly from her corner, and now she spoke up. "Are people really going to come back? After so long?" Morrison turned to her with the same seriousness he'd shown the adults. "That's an excellent question. The truth is, we don't know. Some people may have built new lives elsewhere and have no interest in returning. Others might jump at the chance to reclaim what was taken from them. We won't know until we ask." "How do we ask?" Elias wanted to know. "Some of these families could be anywhere by now." "We start with the ones we can find," Morrison said. "The 17 families still in the territory, according to Mrs. Hale's research. We send letters explaining the situation and inviting them to a meeting. From there, we see who's interested and what they need." Victoria leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "I know this seems overwhelming. Believe me, I've been overwhelmed since the moment I committed to it. But Henry helped me understand something important. We don't have to solve everything at once. We start small, take it step by step, and adjust as we learn what works." "What's the first step?" Elias asked. Morrison shuffled through his papers and pulled out a sheet covered in names and addresses. "These are the 17 families we've located so far. I've drafted a letter explaining the opportunity and requesting their attendance at a meeting 3 weeks from now." Mrs. Hale will host it at her residence in Cheyenne, neutral ground with room for everyone. 3 weeks, Elias repeated. That's not much time. It's enough to send the letters and receive responses. And frankly, we need to move forward with some momentum. The longer we delay, the more room there is for doubt to creep in. Morrison's gaze was steady. For all of us. But Victoria cut slices of Lily's apple cake, serving them on the mismatched plates with a care that suggested she understood the gift being offered. They ate in thoughtful silence, the sweetness of cinnamon and apples filling the small kitchen. "This is delicious, Lily," Victoria said. "Your mother must have been a wonderful baker." "Papa says she could make anything taste good, even prairie grass." Lily giggled at her own joke. "Your papa's right." Victoria smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I never learned to bake, never learned to cook at all, really. We always had servants to do that." "I could teach you," Lily offered. "If you want." The offer hung in the air, simple and genuine. Victoria's eyes glistened. "I would like that very much." After they'd finished eating, Morrison and Elias stepped outside to discuss logistics while Victoria and Lily cleared the dishes. The lawyer pulled out a small notebook and began making notes. "The trust will need operating capital," he said. "Money for supplies, equipment, construction materials. Mrs. Hale is prepared to fund it generously, but I wanted your thoughts on how much will actually be needed." Elias considered the question. "Depends on how many families come back and what they want to do. Farming requires plows, seed, irrigation infrastructure. Ranching needs fencing, corrals, breeding stock. Either way, we're talking thousands of dollars just to get started." Mrs. Hale anticipated as much. She's prepared to commit up to $50,000 initially, with more available if needed. The number was staggering. Elias felt slightly dizzy thinking about that much money being dedicated to a project that might not even work. That's a lot of faith to put in something so uncertain. "Mrs. Hale isn't investing money, Mr. Carter. She's investing in the possibility of redemption. For her, there's no price tag on that." Morrison paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I should tell you something. I knew your grandfather." Elias's head snapped up. "What?" "Thomas Carter. I met him several times over the years. My mother was Helen Morrison, the widow who served as Willow Ridge's doctor. When the settlement was destroyed, she moved to Laramie and I followed. Your grandfather came to visit her occasionally. They'd known each other well in the old days." "Your mother was the one who set his broken leg," Elias said slowly, remembering the story. "After he fell from a horse trying to round up cattle before the foreclosure." "That's right. She said he was the most stubborn patient she'd ever had, refused to stay off the leg for the full healing time." Morrison smiled at the memory. "He talked about you, you know. His grandson who'd taken over the ranch. Said you were everything he'd hoped you'd be, honest, hardworking, committed to the land." Elias felt his throat tighten. "He never told me that." "He wouldn't have. That generation didn't express things directly. But he was proud of you, Mr. Carter. Proud that you'd kept the ranch going when so many others had failed. And I think—" Morrison paused. "I think he'd be proud of what you're doing now, turning old grief into something constructive." They stood in silence for a moment, two men connected by the ghost of a destroyed community and the hope of rebuilding it. Finally, Elias spoke. "Your mother. Is she still—" "She passed 2 years ago, cancer. But she talked about Willow Ridge until the end, about the community they'd built, the way people looked after each other. She said it was the best time of her life, those years before it all fell apart." "Will you come to the meeting, 3 weeks from now?" Morrison nodded. "I wouldn't miss it. This isn't just professional for me, Mr. Carter. It's personal, a chance to honor my mother's memory and help restore something she loved." They went back inside to find Victoria teaching Lily a hand-clapping game, both of them laughing as they stumbled through the complicated pattern. The sound filled the small house with warmth, and Elias felt that now familiar sensation of something shifting, realigning. "We should discuss the meeting logistics," Morrison said, and they spent the next hour going over details. Location, timing, what to include in the letters, how to handle people who might be skeptical or angry or simply overwhelmed by the offer. "Some of them will be suspicious," Elias warned. "The Hale name doesn't exactly inspire trust in people who lost everything to Charles Hale's business practices." "I know," Victoria said quietly. "Which is why you need to be there, Elias. You're one of them. Someone who understands what was lost, who has nothing to gain personally from this. If they're going to trust anyone, it'll be you. No pressure, Elias said dryly, but he nodded. I'll be there. Lily too, if that's all right. Can't leave her alone for that long. I wouldn't have it any other way, Victoria assured him. In fact, having Lily there might help. Hard to stay angry and suspicious when there's a child present, reminding everyone what we're really building toward, a future for the next generation. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows lengthened across the valley, they finalized the plans. Morrison would send the letters within the week. Responses would be directed back to his office in Laramie. 3 weeks from Friday, they'd gather at Victoria's residence in Cheyenne. Those who were interested, those who were willing to consider the possibility of return. When it was time for Victoria and Morrison to leave, Lily hugged Victoria goodbye with the easy affection she'd shown from the start. Will you come back before the big meeting? I will, Victoria promised. And maybe next time you can teach me more about baking, and I can show you how thunder and sage and whisper are growing. I'd like that very much. Elias walked them to the carriage, Morrison climbing in first to give them a moment of relative privacy. Victoria paused with one hand on the carriage door, looking back at the house, the struggling ranch, the man who'd shown her a different way of being in the world. Are you afraid? She asked quietly. Terrified, Elias admitted. This could fail spectacularly. The families might not come, or they might come with expectations we can't meet. We could pour time and money and hope into this and end up with nothing. So why do it? Because my grandfather spent the last 20 years of his life bitter and broken. Because your husband took something beautiful and destroyed it for profit. Because he stopped searching for the right words. Because my daughter is watching, and I want her to learn that when you have a chance to make things right, you take it, even if it's hard, even if it might fail. Victoria reached out and squeezed his hand briefly. Thank you, Elias, for being willing to risk the failure, for seeing past what I've been, for believing that redemption is possible. It's possible, Elias said. Doesn't mean it's easy or guaranteed, but it's possible. He watched the carriage roll away until it disappeared into the dust and distance, Morrison's silver hair visible through the window as he bent over his papers, always working, always planning. Then Elias turned back to find Lily standing on the porch. Papa, are we really going to help all those people come home? We're going to try, sweetheart. Can't promise it'll work, but we'll try our best. Mama used to say that trying your best is what matters most. Your mama was right about a lot of things. That night, after Lily was asleep, Elias sat on the porch and stared up at the vast canopy of stars. Somewhere out there were the scattered remnants of Willow Ridge, families who'd been driven from their homes, who'd rebuilt their lives in new places, who might or might not be willing to believe in the possibility of return. The enormity of what they were attempting settled over him like a physical weight. So many things could go wrong. The families might reject the offer out of hand, unwilling to trust anyone connected to the Hale name. They might come with demands that couldn't be met, expectations that would shatter against the reality of hard frontier life. The land itself might prove less valuable than Victoria believed, the water rights contested, the soil less fertile than hoped, and even if everything went perfectly, even if families returned and the settlement was rebuilt, it wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't restore the original Willow Ridge or bring back the 20 years his grandfather had spent in bitterness. It wouldn't absolve Victoria of her complicity in her husband's crimes. But maybe, Elias thought, that wasn't the point. Maybe the point was simpler. When you had the chance to build something good from something bad, you took it. When you could turn grief into hope, you tried. When redemption was possible, you reached for it, even knowing you might fail. A shooting star streaked across the sky, brief and brilliant. Elias closed his eyes and made a wish. Not for success or riches or easy answers, but for the wisdom to do this right, to honor the past while building toward the future, to create something that would make his grandfather proud and give his daughter faith in the possibility of justice. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of activity. Letters went out to the 17 identified families, carefully worded explanations of Victoria's offer, and invitations to the meeting in Cheyenne. Responses began trickling back, some enthusiastic, others cautious, a few outright hostile. One letter from Marcus Blackwood was particularly pointed. Tell the Hale widow she can't buy her way out of what her husband did. Some debts don't get paid with land. But others were different. The Johnson family's response came from their son Robert, who wrote that his aging parents had never stopped talking about the home they'd lost, that they'd be honored to attend and hear what was being proposed. Maria Hernandez, now Maria Chen, wrote that she'd been dreaming of the valley for 30 years and could hardly believe she might see it again. Elias spent long evenings writing back to each family personally, adding his own voice to Morrison's formal letters. He told them about his grandfather, about the stories he'd grown up hearing, about the hope that maybe, together, they could build something worthy of what had been lost. Victoria came back twice before the scheduled meeting, ostensibly to discuss logistics, but really, Elias suspected, because she craved the connection she'd found in his simple house. She brought supplies, quality paper and pencils for Lily, new boots to replace Elias's worn ones, a bolt of fabric that would make several dresses for a growing girl. These aren't charity, she insisted when Elias protested. Consider them advance payment for your work on the trust. You'll be spending considerable time on this project. It's only fair you be compensated. I don't want to be paid for this. Then consider them gifts from a friend. Can you accept that? The word friend hung between them, new and fragile. Elias found himself nodding. Yeah, I can accept that. The second visit, Victoria brought ingredients and asked Lily to teach her to make bread. They spent the afternoon in the kitchen, flour flying everywhere as Victoria learned to knead dough under Lily's patient instruction. The bread came out heavy and slightly burnt, but Victoria laughed at the result with genuine delight. It's terrible, she said, breaking off a piece. And it's the best thing I've ever made. That's because you made it with your own hands, Lily said wisely. Mama said that things you make yourself always taste better, even if they're not perfect. He lay in bed listening to the house settle around him, thinking about all the people who would gather tomorrow, all the hopes and fears and expectations that would fill Victoria's elegant Cheyenne home. What if this was a mistake? What if bringing these people together only reopened old wounds without providing any real healing? What if they looked at him with contempt, seeing him as a traitor to his grandfather's memory for cooperating with anyone bearing the Hale name? But then he thought about Morrison's quiet words. He'd be proud of what you're doing now, turning old grief into something constructive. He thought about Lily asking if people would really come home. He thought about Victoria's desperate search for redemption and her willingness to risk everything on this impossible project. Sleep finally came near dawn, and when he woke, Lily was already dressed and packed, vibrating with nervous excitement. Do you think they'll like me? She asked as they loaded their bags into the wagon Elias had borrowed for the journey. They'll love you, Elias assured her. You're impossible not to love. The ride to Cheyenne took most of the day, the borrowed wagon creaking along rutted roads under a merciless sun. They arrived as evening was falling, the city's streets busy with end-of-day commerce. Victoria's residence was in the finest part of town, a 3-story brick mansion that made Elias's ranch house look like a child's toy. A servant met them at the door, but Victoria herself appeared moments later, still wearing an apron over her dress. You're here. Come in, come in. I've been cooking all day. Or trying to, anyway. The staff thinks I've lost my mind. The house was overwhelming in its elegance, but Victoria led them past the formal rooms to a large dining room where a long table had been set up. Everyone who responded positively will be here tomorrow, she said. 11 families total. Some couldn't make it due to distance or health, but 11 is more than I dared hope for. That night, Elias and Lily were given rooms on the second floor, each more spacious than their entire house back home. Lily was enchanted by everything: the soft bed, the indoor plumbing, the electric lights that came on with the flip of a switch. Elias was simply uncomfortable, too aware of his rough clothes and work-hardened hands in this environment of refined wealth. But Victoria seemed to understand. When they gathered for a simple dinner, just the 3 of them and Morrison, she kept the conversation light and easy, asking Lily about the coyote pups and discussing ranch logistics with Elias. It was only as they were finishing dessert that she allowed herself to show her nervousness. What if they hate me? She asked quietly. What if they take one look at me and walk out? Then we try again, Elias said. But I don't think that's going to happen. You're offering them something they never thought they'd have again. They might be cautious, might test you, but they'll listen. I hope you're right.
So do I, Elias admitted. Because tomorrow, we find out if any of this is really possible. Morning came too quickly. Elias woke to unfamiliar silence. No roosters crowing, no horses stamping in their stalls, no familiar creaks of his old house settling. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and his stomach clenched with anxiety. Today. The meeting was today. He found Victoria already in the dining room, directing servants as they arranged chairs and prepared refreshments. She looked pale, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a tablecloth that didn't need adjusting. When she saw him, relief flooded her features. "I thought perhaps you'd changed your mind. Left in the night. And missed this?" Elias managed a smile he didn't quite feel. "Not a chance." Lily appeared soon after, her eyes still heavy with sleep but brightening as she took in the preparations. "Is this where everyone will meet?" "Yes, sweetheart. They should start arriving within the hour." The first to come was Robert Johnson, arriving with his elderly parents in a hired carriage. Martin and Eleanor Johnson were both in their 70s now, their faces mapped with the hard years since Willow Ridge. They moved slowly, Martin leaning on a cane, Eleanor's hands gnarled with arthritis, but their eyes were sharp and alert as they took in Victoria's mansion. "Mrs. Hale," Robert said formally, his voice carefully neutral. "My parents, Martin and Eleanor Johnson. They operated the general store in Willow Ridge for 15 years before the acquisition." Victoria stepped forward, and Elias saw her gathering her courage. "Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, thank you for coming. I know this must be difficult being here, considering who I am and what my husband did to your community." Martin Johnson studied her with an intensity that made even Elias uncomfortable. Then he spoke, his voice rough with age and emotion. "When we got the letter, I told Robert it was some kind of trick, some new scheme to squeeze something more out of people who already lost everything. But Eleanor said we should come anyway, hear what you had to say. So here we are." "I'm grateful you came," Victoria said quietly. "Please, come in. There's coffee and breakfast if you're hungry." More people arrived in quick succession. Maria Hernandez Chen came with her husband and 3 grown children, her face lighting up when she saw Eleanor Johnson. The 2 women embraced like sisters, tears streaming down both their faces. The Blackwood brothers arrived separately, Marcus sullen and suspicious, his younger brother James more open but cautious, an elderly couple named Peterson who'd farmed on the western edge of the settlement, a middle-aged woman named Sarah Whitmore, whose parents had run the mill before the Blackwoods bought them out. Each arrival brought new tension, new memories, new grief barely concealed beneath polite greetings. The dining room filled with people who shared a common wound, a collective loss that had shaped the trajectories of their lives. Elias watched them greet each other, saw the way old friendships rekindled instantly despite the decades apart. "Thomas Carter's grandson?" Martin Johnson approached Elias, his rheumy eyes searching. "You look like him. Same stubborn set to the jaw." "Yes, sir. Elias Carter." "Your grandfather was a good man. Proud, maybe too proud, but good. He helped me rebuild my stock after the fire of '72. Wouldn't take payment even when he could barely afford to feed his own family." Martin's voice dropped. "It near killed him when they took Willow Ridge. Broke something in him that never quite healed." "I know, sir. He told me the stories until he died. And now you're here, working with her." Martin jerked his chin toward Victoria. "That takes some explaining, son." Before Elias could respond, Morrison called for everyone's attention. The room fell silent as people found seats around the long table. Lily had positioned herself in a corner with a book, trying to be inconspicuous. But Elias saw several of the older attendees smiling at her presence. Victoria stood at the head of the table, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice barely steady. "I know that being here, in the home of Charles Hale's widow, must feel like a betrayal of everything you lost. I want you to know that I understand that feeling, and I won't blame anyone who chooses to leave." No one moved. The silence stretched taut as wire. Victoria took a shaky breath and continued. "My husband destroyed your community. He used legal manipulation and financial pressure to force you from land you'd worked, homes you'd built, a life you'd created together. And I stood by and let it happen. I wore the dresses bought with that stolen money.
lived in the houses built on that foundation of suffering, and told myself I didn't know, didn't understand, wasn't responsible. Her voice cracked. But I did know. I understood perfectly, and I am responsible, even if the law says otherwise. What Charles did, I allowed. What he destroyed, I helped destroy through my silence and complicity. Marcus Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping harsh against the floor. So you feel guilty? So what? Guilt doesn't give us back the years we lost, the lives we could have lived. You think offering us some land makes up for what was taken? No, Victoria said simply. Nothing makes up for it. The past can't be undone. I can't restore what was destroyed or give back what was stolen. All I can do is offer you a chance to build something new on land that should have been yours all along. Why? The question came from Eleanor Johnson, her voice thin but clear. Why now, after all these years? What do you get out of this? Victoria's hands were shaking visibly now. I get the possibility of being able to look at myself in the mirror again. I get to try to be something other than the woman who profited from other people's pain. I get... She stopped, blinking back tears. I get the hope that maybe it's not too late to be better than I've been. That's not enough, Marcus said harshly. You want redemption? You want to feel better about yourself? That's not a reason to upend our lives again. You're right. Victoria met his angry gaze directly. It's not enough. And it's not about me. That's why I asked Elias to be here, why I asked Henry Morrison to structure this as a trust controlled by you, the families who were harmed. This isn't about my redemption. It's about your restoration. Morrison stood, his calm presence a counterweight to the emotional charge in the room. If I may explain the legal structure we're proposing, Mrs. Hale will deed 500 acres of prime land along the Snake River into an irrevocable trust. The trust will be governed by a board consisting of Mrs. Hale herself, Mr. Carter as her representative, and 3 members elected from among you, the families who choose to participate. He pulled out maps and spread them on the table. This is the land in question. Water rights are included, irrigation infrastructure already in place on the eastern portion. The trust will also be funded with $50,000 initially for development costs, supplies, equipment, construction materials, whatever is needed to establish viable farms or ranches. The numbers drew sharp intakes of breath around the table. $50,000 was a fortune by frontier standards, more money than most of these families would see in a lifetime. What's the catch? This from James Blackwood, less hostile than his brother, but equally wary. No catch, Morrison said. The land is yours to use as you see fit, provided it's used for agricultural purposes and benefits the families involved. You make the decisions about how to divide parcels, what to grow, how to structure the community. Mrs. Hale's only role is as one voice on a 5-person board, with no more power than anyone else. And if we fail? Maria Chen asked quietly. If the land doesn't produce, if we can't make it work? Then you've lost nothing you didn't already lose, Victoria said. The land reverts to the trust, not to me personally. It can't be sold or developed commercially. It remains held for the purpose of restoring what was taken from Willow Ridge. Martin Johnson had been studying the maps with the intensity of a man reading scripture. Now he looked up, his weathered face unreadable. This eastern section with the irrigation, that's where my store used to be, where my family's farm was before I went into storekeeping. Yes, Victoria said quietly, your original parcel, as best we could determine from old surveys. And this? Eleanor pointed to another section. The Hernandez farm, 7 acres cultivated, another 3 in pasture. Maria Chen pressed a hand to her mouth, tears spilling over. You mapped it all? The whole original settlement? Morrison nodded. As accurately as we could from tax records and old surveys. We tried to identify which families had claims to which parcels. It's not perfect. Some records were lost or destroyed, but we did our best. The room fell silent as people leaned over the maps, finding their old homes, tracing boundaries they'd thought lost forever. Elias watched their faces transform, suspicion giving way to wonder, anger softening into possibility. Old wounds weren't healed, but for the first time he saw them beginning to imagine that healing might be possible. I don't understand, the elderly Mr. Peterson said, his voice bewildered. Why would you do this? You're rich, powerful. You don't need our forgiveness or our approval.
Why care about what happened to a handful of farmers 30 years ago? Victoria looked at Lily, sitting quiet in her corner, then at Elias.
Because I spent a night in Elias Carter's home and remembered what it felt like to be human. Because his daughter showed me her treasures, rocks and feathers, and talked about them like they were precious. Because I realized that I'd spent decades surrounded by wealth and luxury and had nothing, while people like you had lost everything and still had each other. She turned back to Peterson. I can't undo the past. I can't make Charles Hale a good man or myself blameless, but I can try to build something good from something terrible. And maybe, in doing that, I can remember what it means to be part of something larger than myself. Pretty words, Marcus said, but there was less heat in his voice now. But words are cheap. How do we know this is real, that you won't change your mind or find some legal loophole to take it all back? Morrison pulled out a thick document. The trust agreement is irrevocable once executed. Mrs. Hale cannot dissolve it, cannot reclaim the land, cannot override the board's decisions. I've structured it specifically to prevent any possibility of reversal. Why would you do that? James Blackwood asked Victoria directly. Why tie your own hands so completely? Because anything less would be meaningless. If I could take it back, if I retained control, then I'd just be buying your cooperation, not offering real restoration. This has to be genuine, or it's nothing. Robert Johnson had been quiet through most of the meeting, but now he spoke. My parents are old. They've talked about Willow Ridge every day of my life, but I don't know if they could handle the physical demands of starting over. Would there be room in this for people who can't farm themselves but want to be part of the community? That's for the board to decide, Morrison said. But I'd imagine a functioning community needs more than just farmers. Stores, services, craftsmen. The trust agreement is flexible enough to accommodate different types of participation. Martin Johnson reached for his wife's hand. Eleanor and I, we can't work a farm anymore. But we ran that store for 15 years, knew every family, every child. If there's a way for us to be part of this, to see Willow Ridge live again, even if we're just shopkeepers again. His voice broke, and Eleanor finished for him. We'd like to come home. The words hung in the air like a benediction. Maria Chen wiped her eyes and nodded. My children never knew the valley, never understood when I talked about the creek where I played as a girl, the fields we planted together, the way the whole community would gather for harvest. I want them to see it, to understand what we lost and what we're building back. One by one, others voiced interest, cautious, qualified, but genuine. The Peterson couple wanted to see the land before committing. Sarah Whitmore worried about her own children's schooling, but thought perhaps a school could be part of the community rebuilding. James Blackwood admitted he'd always dreamed of returning, though his brother remained skeptical. Marcus stood again, his face still hard, but something shifting in his eyes. I won't lie and say I trust this. Won't pretend that the Hale name doesn't make my skin crawl. But, he paused, struggling with the words, but my father died talking about that land, died wishing he could see the mill running again, see the valley the way it was. If there's even a chance of making that happen, I guess I owe it to him to try. Victoria's face crumpled with relief and gratitude. Thank you, all of you, for being willing to even consider this. Don't thank us yet, Martin Johnson said gruffly. We haven't agreed to anything except listening. There's a lot to work out. How the land gets divided, what happens if some of us want to farm and others want to ranch, how we handle water rights and grazing. This won't be easy. No, Elias spoke for the first time since the meeting began. It won't be easy. Building something never is, and rebuilding is even harder. But my grandfather spent 20 years talking about Willow Ridge like it was paradise lost. 20 years of bitterness and grief over what was taken. I think he'd rather have spent those years working to build something new, even if it was hard, even if it was different from what was lost. He looked around the table at the assembled faces. I can't promise this will work. Can't promise the land will produce, or the community will thrive, or any of us will get back what was taken. All I can promise is that if we try this, we try it together. No one person controlling everything, no hidden agendas, just people working towards something better than what came before. You really believe that's possible? Marcus challenged. After everything? I have to believe it, Elias said quietly. Because my daughter's watching, and I want her to learn that restoration is possible. That people can change, Communities can be rebuilt, and justice, even imperfect justice, is worth fighting for. Lily looked up from her corner, her young face serious. My papa says that holding on to anger just makes you hurt yourself, that it's better to build something new than to keep looking at what got broken. The simple wisdom from a child's mouth broke something in the room's tension. Eleanor Johnson smiled through her tears. Smart girl. Sounds like something my mother used to say. Morrison cleared his throat. I propose we take a break. Let everyone look over the maps and documents more carefully. Then we can reconvene to discuss next steps, site visits to the land, preliminary discussions about parceling, timeline for development. People stood, stretching, moving toward the refreshments. Small conversations sparked up around the room, old neighbors reconnecting, sharing stories, tentatively beginning to imagine possibility. Victoria remained at the head of the table, looking overwhelmed and fragile and hopeful all at once. Martin Johnson approached her, Eleanor on his arm. For a long moment, the old man just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he extended his hand. I won't say I forgive what your husband did, won't say this makes everything right, but I appreciate what you're trying to do here. It takes courage to face the people you've wronged and offer more than empty apologies. Victoria took his hand with both of hers, tears streaming down her face. Thank you. You don't know what that means. I think I do, Eleanor said softly. I think you've been carrying this weight for a long time, and you're finally trying to set it down. That's hard work, harder than most people know. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the atmosphere in the room gradually transformed. The initial hostility gave way to cautious cooperation as people pored over maps and made tentative plans. Robert Johnson and Maria Chen's husband began discussing irrigation possibilities. James Blackwood sketched out ideas for a sawmill on paper borrowed from Morrison. The Peterson couple talked quietly about whether their old bones could handle one more frontier challenge. Lily moved through the room like a small ambassador, offering refreshments and asking innocent questions that somehow eased tensions. When she asked Marcus Blackwood about the mill his father had run, the bitter man's face softened as he described the massive water wheel, the smell of fresh-cut lumber, the satisfaction of transforming raw logs into finished boards. You should build it again, Lily said simply. Then you could show people how it worked. Maybe I will, Marcus said, and there was something like hope in his voice. By mid-afternoon, Morrison had organized people into working groups. One cluster focused on land division, trying to balance historical claims with current needs. Another discussed infrastructure requirements, housing, barns, fencing, irrigation. A third tackled governance questions about how the community would make collective decisions. Elias found himself at the center of multiple conversations, his practical ranching knowledge valuable to people planning their return. He helped the Petersons understand how much land they'd need for the small dairy operation they were considering, advised Sarah Whitmore on where to position a house for the best water access. Listened as Martin Johnson sketched out his vision for a new general store that could serve as community gathering place just like the old one had. Victoria moved through the room more quietly, mostly listening, occasionally answering questions about the trust fund or legal details. But Elias noticed how people's attitudes toward her were shifting, still wary, still carrying the weight of old wounds, but beginning to see her as a person, rather than just a symbol of past wrongs. As evening approached, Morrison called everyone back to the main table. We've made remarkable progress today, he said, more than I honestly expected. The question now is whether you're ready to move forward formally, to elect board members, schedule site visits, and begin the actual work of restoration. I move we elect board members today, Robert Johnson said. No point delaying. We need 3 people from the families present, plus Mr. Carter and Mrs. Hale. I nominate my father, Martin Johnson. I second that, Maria Chen said immediately. Martin looked startled but pleased. I'm an old man, not sure I'm the best choice. You're the best choice because you remember, Eleanor said firmly. You remember what Willow Ridge was, what it meant. We need that memory to guide us. The nomination was approved unanimously. 2 more board positions remained. After brief discussion, Maria Chen and James Blackwood were elected. Maria for her optimism and James for his practical skills and willingness to build bridges with his more skeptical brother. That gives us our board, Morrison said, making notes. Martin Johnson, Maria Chen, James Blackwood from the returning families, Elias Carter as Mrs. Hale's representative, and Victoria Hale herself, all in favor of this board composition? Hands rose around the table. Even Marcus Blackwood raised his grudgingly. Carried. The board's first order of business should be scheduling a site visit for interested families. I suggest 2 weeks from today, weather permitting. That gives everyone time to make arrangements and for Mrs. Hale to prepare the property for inspection. Agreed, Martin said, already looking more comfortable in his role as board member. And I think we should bring our families. Let the younger generation see what we're talking about, help them understand what we're trying to build. The meeting continued through dinner, which Victoria's staff served in shifts so the work could continue. Legal documents were reviewed and signed. Preliminary timelines were established. Questions about everything from water rights to property boundaries were raised, discussed, sometimes answered, and sometimes tabled for future consideration. Through it all, Elias watched the transformation with something like awe. These people who'd arrived as strangers bound only by shared trauma were beginning to function as a community again. Old friendships rekindled, new connections formed. The younger generation, Maria's children, Robert Johnson, Sarah Whitmore's teenage son, started their own conversations about what a new Willow Ridge could be. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the meeting finally broke up. People left in clusters, still talking, making plans to visit each other before the site inspection, exchanging addresses for correspondence. Martin Johnson gripped Elias's hand firmly as he departed. Your grandfather would be proud, son. This is good work you're doing. When the last guest had departed and the servants had cleared away the remnants of the long day, Victoria collapsed into a chair in her private sitting room. Elias and Lily had been invited to join her for a final cup of tea before retiring. I can't believe that happened, Victoria said, her voice raw with exhaustion and emotion. I keep waiting to wake up and find it was a dream. It happened, Elias confirmed. And now the real work begins. Today was just words and plans. Making it real will be harder. I know. But for the first time in years, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, something real. She looked at Lily, who was fighting sleep in her chair. Thank you for being here, for lending me your credibility. Without you, they never would have listened. They listened because they wanted to believe, Elias said. Because the dream of home is powerful, even after all these years. We just gave them permission to hope again. Do you think it will work? Really work? Elias considered the question honestly. I think some of it will work. Some people will come back, build good lives, create something worth having. Others might try and fail or decide it's not for them after all. That's how these things go. But even if only half of what we're planning succeeds, it'll still be more than existed before. Victoria smiled tiredly. I'll take half. I'll take anything that's real and good and built on something other than exploitation. Lily's eyes were closing despite her best efforts to stay awake. Elias scooped her up, feeling her settle against his shoulder with the boneless trust of childhood. We should turn in. Tomorrow's another long day of travel back home. Will you come back for the site visit, both of you? Wouldn't miss it, Elias promised. That night, lying in the unfamiliar luxury of Victoria's guest room with Lily asleep in the adjoining chamber, Elias thought about his grandfather, about the bitter old man who died still grieving for what was lost, about the stories told and retold until they'd worn grooves in memory. Thomas Carter hadn't lived to see this day, hadn't known that restoration was possible, but maybe, Elias thought, some part of him knew. Some part of him had passed those stories down, not just as monuments to grief, but as seeds of hope, waiting for the right conditions to finally grow. The journey home the next day was quiet, both Elias and Lily lost in their own thoughts. The landscape rolled past, familiar and unchanged, but somehow it looked different now, full of possibility instead of just struggle. Papa, Lily said as they neared the ranch, what Mrs. Hale is doing, making up for bad things. Is that what being good means? Elias considered the question carefully. Being good means trying to do right, even when it's hard. Mrs. Hale can't undo what her husband did, can't make the past different, but she can try to build something better for the future. That's what we all do, sweetheart. We make mistakes, hurt people sometimes even when we don't mean to. Being good isn't about being perfect. It's about trying to do better when you know you've done wrong. Like when I broke your favorite cup and then helped you clean it up and said sorry. Exactly like that. You couldn't unbreak the cup, but you took responsibility and tried to make it right. That's what matters. As they pulled up to the ranch house, everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The sagging barn, the dusty yard, the thin cattle in their sparse pasture. But Elias saw it differently now, through eyes adjusted by the events of the past weeks. This wasn't failure. This was survival. This was a man holding on to what mattered despite every hardship, every setback, every reason to give up. And soon, if everything went as planned, this ranch would be part of something larger. Part of a community rebuilding itself, people coming together to create something better than what had been destroyed. The work ahead would be immense. The challenges would be real. Success was far from guaranteed, but for the first time in years, Elias felt something he'd almost forgotten: hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of a drowning man, but the solid, grounded hope of someone who'd seen impossible things become possible through honest work and shared purpose. He unhitched the horses and began the evening chores, Lily chattering beside him about everything she'd seen in Cheyenne. The sun sank toward the horizon, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, maybe thunder or sage or whisper, growing up and preparing to find their own territories. Change was coming to this valley. Slow, hard-won change built on the ruins of old injustice and the foundation of new hope. And Elias Carter, grandson of Thomas Carter of Willow Ridge, was going to be part of making it happen. The 2 weeks before the site visit passed in a flurry of preparation. Victoria sent word that she'd arranged for wagons to transport families from Cheyenne to the land, and that she'd hired workers to clear some of the overgrown areas so people could actually see what they'd be working with. Elias spent his days finishing ranch work and his evenings writing letters to the families who'd expressed interest, answering questions about soil quality, weather patterns, and the realities of frontier life. On the morning they were due to depart for the site visit, Elias stood on his porch watching the sun rise over the valley. In a few hours, he'd hitch up the wagon and head out to meet the others. In a few days, people would walk on land they'd thought lost forever and decide whether the dream of return was worth the reality of hard work ahead. "Papa, I packed sandwiches for the trip," Lily called from inside. "And I brought my drawing supplies so I can make pictures of the new Willow Ridge for everyone." Elias smiled at her enthusiasm. She'd talked of little else for 2 weeks, imagining the community that would rise from the valley, the friends she'd make, the adventures she'd have. Her excitement was contagious, making him believe that maybe, just maybe, they were building something that would last. The journey took most of the day. When they finally reached the meeting point, a crossroads near the eastern boundary of the trust land, Elias found a small caravan already assembled. Victoria's elegant carriage sat alongside hired wagons carrying the Johnson family, the Chens, the Petersons, and others. Martin Johnson waved from his seat, looking younger somehow, energized by the prospect of seeing his old home. "Mr. Carter!" Victoria emerged from her carriage wearing practical traveling clothes instead of her usual finery. She'd tied her hair back simply and wore sturdy boots caked with dust from the road. "We were just waiting for you. Everyone's here now." Morrison appeared from one of the wagons, his ever-present satchel in hand. "I've prepared a route that will take us through the main sections of the property. We'll start with the river valley where most of the original farms were located, then move up to the higher ground suitable for grazing." They set out in procession, wagons creaking over rough terrain that hadn't seen much traffic in years. The land opened before them gradually, first scrubland and rocky outcroppings, then the valley beginning to green as they descended toward the river. The Snake River itself appeared like a silver ribbon winding through the landscape, its water running clear and strong even in the late summer drought. Martin Johnson stood up in his wagon despite his wife's protests, his old eyes fixed on the valley with an intensity that bordered on religious. "There," he said, his voice breaking. "Right there. That bend in the river. That's where our farm was. I'd know it anywhere." Eleanor was crying openly now, her gnarled hands pressed to her mouth. Their son Robert sat between them, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he saw the land his parents had mourned for 3 decades. The wagon stopped at the valley floor, and people climbed down slowly, reverently, as if stepping onto sacred ground. Maria Chen walked straight to the riverbank and knelt, running her fingers through the soil. When she stood, tears streaked her face, but she was smiling. "It's the same," she whispered. "After all these years, it's the same. The soil, the smell of the water, even the way the light hits the cottonwoods." Her children stood behind her, finally understanding what their mother had tried to describe all their lives. Her eldest daughter, Anna, put a hand on Maria's shoulder. "It's beautiful, Mama. I see why you never stopped talking about it." James Blackwood had wandered upstream to where a stone foundation still stood, the remnants of the old mill. He knelt beside it, running his hands over stones his father had laid 40 years ago. His brother Marcus joined him silently, and for a long moment the two men just stood there, connected by memory and loss and the possibility of restoration. "We could rebuild it," James said quietly. "Not exactly the same, but something that honors what Dad built." Marcus nodded slowly. Yeah, we could do that." Victoria hung back from the family reunions, watching from a distance. Elias saw the complex emotions playing across her face, grief for the suffering her husband had caused, hope that this might heal some of those wounds, fear that it still wouldn't be enough. He moved to stand beside her. "This is your doing," he said quietly. "All of this. Whatever happens next, you gave them this day." "I gave them back what should never have been taken," Victoria corrected. "That's not generosity. That's the bare minimum of justice." "Maybe. But you're the one who chose to do it when you could have just lived with the guilt." They walked together along the riverbank while Morrison led the families on a more detailed tour, pointing out property boundaries and discussing water rights. Lily had found Anna Chen, and the two girls were skipping stones across the water, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Victoria said. "After the families settle, after the buildings go up and the crops are planted. I want to sell the mining company, the railroad holdings, all of Charles's business interests. Everything built on the same kind of ruthless exploitation that destroyed this place." Elias stopped walking. "That's your entire fortune." "It's blood money," Victoria said flatly. "I can't keep profiting from it, not now that I understand what it cost. I'll keep enough to live modestly, donate the rest to establishing schools and hospitals in communities that need them. Make something good from something terrible. That's a big decision. It's the only decision that makes sense. I can't build a new life on the foundation of the old one. Not anymore." She looked at him seriously. "I was thinking of staying, not in Cheyenne, but here, in the valley. If the community will have me." The words hung between them, full of implications. "You want to live in Willow Ridge? You, who's never farmed or ranched a day in your life?" "I want to learn. I want to be part of something real instead of just funding it from a distance. I want—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I want to belong somewhere. To people who see me as Victoria, not as the Hale fortune. And I thought maybe here, with these families who are all starting over, I might find that. What about when it gets hard? When your hands blister from work? When winter comes and the wind cuts through the walls? When you're exhausted and sore and wondering why you gave up your comfortable life?" Victoria met his eyes steadily. "Then I'll remember that discomfort isn't the same as suffering, that hard work isn't the same as hardship, that being part of something real is worth more than any amount of easy luxury." Before Elias could respond, Martin Johnson called out from upstream. "Elias, Mrs. Hale, you need to see this." They hurried to where a group had gathered around what looked like an old well, partially collapsed but still recognizable. Martin was on his knees beside it, laughing and crying at the same time. "We dug this well together," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Every family in the settlement, we spent a week digging down until we hit clean water. Best water in the territory, cold even in summer. And it's still here. After everything, it's still here." Morrison knelt beside him, examining the stonework. "With some repair, it could function again. The aquifer underneath is clearly still active. You can see water at the bottom." "Then that's where we start," Martin declared, standing with renewed energy despite his age. "We repair this well first, before anything else. It was the heart of the old community. It can be the heart of the new one." The pronouncement felt significant, almost ceremonial. People gathered around the well, some touching the old stones, others simply standing witness. This physical connection to the past gave shape to the future they were imagining. The tour continued through the afternoon. Morrison showed them the irrigation channels that had been installed years ago, still functional with some maintenance. They walked the boundaries of the original farms, marked now only by subtle changes in vegetation and occasional remnants of old fencing. They climbed to higher ground where the grazing land stretched for miles, grass already greening from recent rains. By late afternoon, the group had assembled on a rise overlooking the entire valley. The Snake River wound through the bottomland, cottonwoods marking its course in a line of green. The mountains rose purple in the distance, snow-capped peaks catching the slanting sun. It was achingly beautiful, the kind of country that got into your bones and never let go.
"So," Morrison said, breaking the reverent silence, "we've seen the land. The question now is, who's ready to commit? Who's willing to come back and build something here?" Martin Johnson's hand was first in the air. "Eleanor and I can't farm anymore, but we can run a store. Every community needs a gathering place, somewhere people can get supplies and swap news. We're in." "We'll take the old Hernandez parcel," Maria Chen said, her husband nodding agreement. "Our children are strong, ready to work. We'll grow wheat and vegetables, maybe keep some chickens." One by one, families committed. The Petersons would start a small dairy operation. James Blackwood would rebuild the mill with his brother's reluctant help. Sarah Whitmore wanted the western section for a horse ranch, something she'd always dreamed of. Robert Johnson planned to build a house for his parents near the new store and help however he was needed. Not everyone committed. Some families asked for more time to consider. A few admitted the dream of return wasn't worth the reality of starting over. But by the time the sun was setting, 8 families had formally agreed to participate, with 3 more saying they'd likely join once they settled their affairs elsewhere. "That's enough," Martin said with satisfaction. 8 families is enough to build a real community. We'll need to meet again, work out the details of who gets which parcels, but this is happening. Willow Ridge is coming back. The certainty in his voice made it real. This wasn't speculation anymore, wasn't just hopeful planning. This was actual restoration, people committing their lives and futures to rebuilding what had been destroyed. That night they camped near the river, too energized to make the journey back. Fires were lit, food shared, stories told. The older generation recounted memories of the original Willow Ridge, while the younger generation asked questions and made plans. Lily sat with Anna Chen and the Peterson grandchildren, drawing pictures of how she imagined the new settlement would look. Elias found himself sitting slightly apart from the main group with Victoria, both of them watching the firelight play across eager faces. The conversation had turned to logistics. Who would come first to begin building? What supplies would be needed immediately? How to coordinate the work? "I meant what I said earlier," Victoria told him quietly. "About staying, about being part of this." "I know you did. Question is whether you understand what you're committing to. This isn't going to be romantic or noble most days. It's going to be back-breaking work with uncertain outcomes." "I know that too." She turned to face him fully. "Elias, I've spent my entire adult life insulated from real hardship. Everything was easy, comfortable, arranged for my convenience, and I was miserable. More miserable than I knew how to admit, even to myself." That night in your home, eating simple food and washing dishes and listening to Lily's stories, that was the first time in years I felt actually alive. She gestured toward the families gathered around the fire. "These people are giving me a chance I don't deserve, a chance to be part of something real, to build instead of destroy, to belong instead of just existing. I'm not going to waste it by staying comfortable." "Where will you live? Your mansion in Cheyenne isn't exactly practical for frontier life." "I'll build something here, something simple. Maybe you could help me design it. Something that actually makes sense for this climate, this landscape, this life." The request was both practical and symbolic, asking him to help her create a place in this new world they were building. Elias found himself nodding. "I could do that. Nothing fancy, but solid and functional. That's all I want. Solid and functional and real." Morrison joined them, his face reflecting satisfaction and exhaustion in equal measure. "I've been doing this kind of legal work for 30 years, he said, settling onto a log near their fire. "Property disputes, business contracts, estate planning. This is the first time I've felt like the law was actually serving justice instead of just managing greed." "Your mother would be proud," Elias said. "I think she would be. She always said the law was meant to protect the vulnerable, not just serve the powerful."
Most of my career, I've watched it do the opposite. He looked out at the valley, barely visible now in the darkness. Bringing this place back. It feels like finally living up to what she taught me. The conversation drifted, plans giving way to stories, giving way to companionable silence. Eventually, people began settling in for the night, bedrolls spread around the dying fires. Elias checked on Lily and found her already asleep between Anna Chen and one of the Peterson girls, the three of them curled together like puppies. He sat up late watching the stars wheel overhead, thinking about everything that had happened since Victoria's carriage had first appeared on his road. How impossible it had all seemed then. This wealthy stranger with her strange offer, the revelation of her connection to his grandfather's destroyed home, the audacious plan to rebuild a community that had been gone for 30 years. And yet here they were. 8 families committed to return, more likely to follow. 500 acres of good land dedicated to restoration. A trust fund ensuring the resources to make it work. And most impossibly, a wealthy widow who'd spent decades complicit in exploitation, now ready to give up everything comfortable to build a new life on the frontier. The next morning dawned clear and cool, mist rising from the river in ghostly ribbons. People woke slowly, stretching out the stiffness of sleeping on hard ground. Breakfast was simple, coffee and hardtack and whatever supplies people had brought. But the mood was jubilant, the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're part of something bigger than yourself. Before they broke camp, Martin Johnson called everyone together by the old well. "I want to make this official," he said. "Not legally, Morrison can handle that later, but I want us all to commit out loud to what we're building here." He pulled out a small Bible, worn from years of use. This belonged to my father. He read from it every Sunday in the original Willow Ridge. I'd like each family that's committed to coming back to put their hand on this and make a promise. Not to me, not to Mrs. Hale, but to each other. That we'll build a community based on cooperation instead of competition. That we'll help each other succeed instead of trying to get ahead at each other's expense. That we'll create something worth passing on to our children. One by one, families came forward. Hands piled on the old Bible. Weathered rancher hands and soft town hands, young hands and old hands, scarred hands and smooth hands. Maria Chen spoke for her family in Spanish, then English. The Blackwood brothers made their promise together, their earlier antagonism replaced by tentative brotherhood. When Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, she added her own clause. And that will welcome anyone who needs a place to belong, regardless of where they came from or what they've done. She looked directly at Victoria as she said it, and others nodded agreement. The message was clear. This community would be defined not by past sins, but by present commitment. When it came time for Victoria to make her promise, her hands shook as she reached for the Bible. "I promise to use what I have not for power, but for service. To work alongside you as an equal, not above you as a benefactor. To build with my own hands and learn from my own mistakes. And to never forget what was lost here, or the suffering that my family caused." Her voice broke on the last words, but she held steady, meeting each person's eyes in turn. Martin Johnson put his other hand over hers. "We accept your promise. And we offer you the same thing we're offering each other, a fresh start. The past matters, but it doesn't define the future unless we let it." The moment felt sacred despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. No grand speeches, no official ceremonies, just people making promises to each other under an endless sky, committing to build something better than what had come before. The journey back to Cheyenne was quieter, everyone lost in thoughts of what came next. Plans needed to be finalized, supplies ordered, timelines established. The first wave of families would come in early spring, giving them time to plant crops and build basic shelter before winter. Others would follow as circumstances allowed. Morrison had already begun drafting the formal parcel assignments, trying to balance historical claims with current capabilities and desires. The trust fund would be released in phases. Initial disbursements for essential supplies and equipment, later releases as families proved they could sustain themselves. It was a delicate balance between providing support and fostering independence. Back at Victoria's mansion, the group held one final meeting to formalize the decisions made at the site. Legal documents were signed, money transferred, responsibilities assigned. The board scheduled its next meeting for 3 months out, with interim check-ins by telegraph. As people prepared to depart for their various homes, Martin Johnson pulled Elias aside. I want you to know something, son. Your grandfather, Thomas, he died bitter, died angry at the world for what was taken. But somewhere, somehow, I like to think he knows about this, knows that his grandson helped bring Willow Ridge back, even if it's different from what was lost. I hope so, Elias said quietly. I think about him a lot through all this. Wonder what he'd say. He'd say you did good. He'd say you honored his memory not by holding on to his anger, but by transforming it into something constructive. Martin gripped Elias's shoulder. That's the best legacy anyone can leave. Children who are better than they were. The words stayed with Elias on the long ride home. Lily dozed against his shoulder as the wagon creaked along familiar roads. The ranch appeared on the horizon, still struggling, still barely holding on, but no longer representing failure. It represented perseverance, the kind of stubborn integrity that made restoration possible. Over the following months, Elias watched the transformation unfold. The first families arrived in March, Martin and Eleanor Johnson among them. True to their word, they began building a general store near the restored well, using lumber from James Blackwood's newly operational mill. The structure went up with help from everyone, neighbors working together just as they had in the original Willow Ridge. Victoria was true to her promise as well. She sold the mining company and railroad holdings, keeping only enough to fund her new life and establish the charitable trust for schools and hospitals. She had a simple cabin built on a small parcel near the river, refusing to make it any larger or finer than what others were building. Elias helped her design it, teaching her how to think about water access, sun exposure, wind protection. He was there the day she drove her first nail, laughing at her clumsy technique but impressed by her determination. Her hands blistered and bled those first weeks, but she never complained, just wrapped them and kept working. Maria Chen and her family planted wheat that first spring, their children working the fields with an enthusiasm born of finally understanding their mother's stories. The Peterson dairy started small, just 3 cows, but the milk and butter they produced became precious commodities in the growing community. Sarah Whitmore brought her first horses to the western parcel, beautiful animals that drew admirers from miles around. By summer, the valley had transformed. Houses dotted the landscape, fields showed green with growing crops, the sound of hammers and saws echoed from the mill. The well that had been the heart of the old community became the heart of the new one, people gathering there daily to draw water and exchange news. Elias found himself spending more time in the valley than at his own ranch. There was always something to help with, a barn raising, fence mending, advice needed on irrigation or grazing. Lily came with him whenever possible, delighting in the growing community and the friends she was making. One afternoon in late July, Elias and Victoria stood together on the same ridge where he'd first told her about his grandfather's connection to Willow Ridge. Below them, the settlement spread out in living proof that restoration was possible. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in the spaces between buildings, and the sound of community life drifted up on the warm breeze. I tried to buy a single night of comfort, Victoria said quietly. One night to remember what it felt like to be human, to be part of a family, to belong somewhere. And instead I found a home, a purpose, a future worth more than all the money I gave up. She turned to look at him, her face tanned now from outdoor work, her hands calloused, her expensive dresses replaced by simple practical clothing. I found people who saw past what I'd been to what I was trying to become. That's worth everything. Elias thought about that strange afternoon when she'd stepped from her carriage with her impossible offer. How suspicious he'd been, how certain the wealth and elegance couldn't coexist with genuine need, how wrong he'd been. You know what my grandfather used to say? He asked. He said that land doesn't belong to people, people belong to land, that the valley claims you, makes you part of itself, and once it does, you never really leave even if you travel 1,000 miles away. I think I understand that now. Victoria looked out at the settlement, at the life they'd built together. This valley has claimed me. These people have claimed me. I belong here in a way I never belonged anywhere else. Below them, Martin Johnson emerged from his store and waved up at the ridge, having spotted them there. They waved back and Elias saw the old man smile before returning inside. The store had become exactly what Martin hoped, a gathering place where people shared stories and news, where the community came together. That evening, there was a celebration in the valley, the first official community gathering of the new Willow Ridge. Tables were set up outside the store, food contributed by every family. There was fresh bread from the Johnsons' kitchen, vegetables from the Chen fields, butter and cheese from the Peterson dairy. Someone had brought a fiddle, and soon music filled the warm summer air. Lily danced with Anna Chen and the other children, their laughter bright against the deepening dusk. Adults talked and ate and made plans, the conversation flowing easily between practical matters and pure enjoyment. This was what community looked like, Elias thought. Not just people living near each other, but people building something together. Victoria stood slightly apart from the main celebration, watching with an expression of wonder and belonging. Elias joined her, and they stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. "I was so lonely," she said quietly. "For so many years, surrounded by people, but completely alone. I thought wealth would protect me from hardship, but all it did was isolate me from everything real. You're not isolated anymore." "No." She smiled, watching the community she'd helped create. "No, I'm not. I have neighbors who call me by my first name. I have work that means something. I have—" She paused, searching for the right word. "I have home. Finally, after all these years, I have home." Martin Johnson approached them, moving carefully on his cane, but with energy that belied his age. "There you two are. We're about to make a toast, and we need the board members present." He led them to where the other board members had gathered: Maria Chen, James Blackwood, Morrison, who'd traveled in for the celebration. The larger community clustered around, curious and expectant. "A year ago," Martin began, his voice carrying across the assembly, "most of us thought Willow Ridge was lost forever. A memory, a ghost story, something we told our children to help them understand where they came from. But here we are, standing on the same ground our parents and grandparents worked, drinking from the same well, building something new on the foundation of what was lost." He raised his glass, and others followed suit. "To the new Willow Ridge. May it be everything the old one was and more. May the mistakes of the past guide us to better choices in the future. And may we never forget that community isn't just about land or buildings. It's about people choosing to build something together." "To Willow Ridge!" the crowd echoed, voices rising in chorus. As people drank and the celebration continued, Elias felt Lily tug on his sleeve. "Papa, can we stay? Not just visit, but really stay. I like it here. I like having friends and neighbors." Elias looked around at the community that had formed, at the life that was blooming in this valley. His own ranch was still struggling, still barely holding on. But here, surrounded by people working together, he could see a different future, a sustainable future. "Would you like that? Living here instead of at the ranch?" "The ranch will always be special because it's where Mama lived," Lily said, with the wisdom of someone far older than her years. "But Mama's not there anymore. She's in here." She touched her heart. "And I think she'd want us to be where we're happy, where we have people around us." "I think you're right, sweetheart." The decision settled over him with surprising ease. He could sell the ranch. It wouldn't bring much, but enough to build a proper house here in the valley. He could join the community not as an outside advisor, but as a full member, contributing his knowledge and labor to the collective effort. He could give Lily the childhood surrounded by community that he'd had before Willow Ridge was destroyed. He found Victoria later that evening, and when he told her his decision, her face lit up with undisguised joy. "You're staying? Really staying?" "Really staying. Lily wants friends and neighbors, and I want—" He paused, realizing the truth as he spoke it. "I want to be part of this, part of something bigger than just survival, part of a community that's choosing to build something good from something terrible." "I'm glad," Victoria said simply. "I'm so glad you'll be here." The summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter. The new Willow Ridge weathered its first season successfully. Crops harvested, animals sheltered, supplies laid in against the cold months. People gathered often at the store, sharing resources and stories, helping each other through the inevitable challenges. Elias built his house near Victoria's cabin, the two structures close enough for easy visiting, but separate enough for independence. Lily thrived in the community, making friends and learning from the various families. She spent afternoons helping Eleanor Johnson in the store, mornings gathering eggs with the Chen children, evenings learning to ride from Sarah Whitmore. Victoria learned to cook and garden, to mend fences and care for the chickens she'd acquired. Her transformation from wealthy widow to frontier woman wasn't always smooth. There were tears and frustrations and moments when she clearly wondered what she'd been thinking. But she never quit, never retreated to her old life of easy comfort. Spring came again, bringing new families to the valley. Word had spread about what was happening in Willow Ridge, and people who'd never lived there originally began asking if they could join. The board met to discuss it, ultimately deciding that the settlement's purpose had evolved beyond simple restoration. It was about creating community, about offering belonging to anyone willing to contribute. On the anniversary of that first meeting in Victoria's Cheyenne mansion, the community gathered again to celebrate. The valley had transformed beyond recognition. Nearly 20 families now called it home, with more arriving each month. Fields stretched green with spring planting, new buildings stood solid and well-built, and the sound of life filled the air. Martin Johnson stood to speak, but this time he called Elias and Victoria to stand with him. "These two people," he said, gesturing to them, "they're the reason we're all here." One of them descended from Willow Ridge carrying the grief and stories of what was lost. The other carrying the guilt and resources of what was taken. Together, they chose to transform all that pain into something new, something better. He looked at them both seriously. "We came here thinking we were getting back what was stolen, but what we've built is something different, not a recreation of the past, but a new creation informed by it. A community that remembers injustice, but chooses restoration, that honors grief, but builds toward hope." The words settled over the assembly, true and powerful. This wasn't the old Willow Ridge returned. It was something new, shaped by the past, but not limited by it. As the celebration continued, Elias found himself standing once more on the ridge overlooking the valley, this time with Victoria and Lily beside him. The three of them looked down at the lights beginning to glow in windows as dusk fell, at the smoke rising from chimneys, at the evidence of lives being lived in community. "Do you think your grandfather would be proud?" Victoria asked quietly. Elias considered the question, thinking about the bitter old man who died mourning what was lost. "I think he'd be surprised," he said finally. "Surprised that restoration was possible. Surprised that the Hale name could be associated with anything good. But, yeah, I think he'd be proud. Not of getting back exactly what was taken, but of building something worthy of what was lost." "And you?" Victoria asked. "Are you proud of what we've built?" "Yeah," Elias said, pulling Lily close against his side. "Yeah, I am. This isn't perfect. It never will be. There will be conflicts and failures and disappointments ahead. But it's real. It's people choosing to build something together instead of tearing each other apart. That's worth being proud of." Lily looked up at both of them, her young face serious. "Mama used to say that the best stories are the ones where people choose to be better than they have to be, where they do the right thing even when it's hard. I think we're in one of those stories." Victoria knelt down to Lily's level, tears glistening in her eyes. "I think you're right, sweetheart, and I'm honored to be part of it, to be part of your story." They stood together as full darkness fell, three people connected by an impossible chain of events that had transformed all their lives. A wealthy widow seeking redemption, a struggling rancher honoring his grandfather's memory, a child learning that justice was possible and community was worth fighting for. Below them, Willow Ridge glowed with life and promise. It wasn't the settlement that had been destroyed 30 years ago, that was gone forever, mourned but not recoverable. This was something new, built on the foundation of old grief but reaching toward new hope. A place where past wrongs informed but didn't dictate the future, where people from different backgrounds and histories chose to build something together. As they walked back down the ridge toward their homes, toward the community that had claimed them all, Elias thought about that morning when Victoria's carriage had appeared on his road. How impossible everything had seemed then. How certain he'd been that wealth and genuine need couldn't coexist, that restoration was just a pretty dream. He'd been wrong about so many things. But he'd been right about the most important thing. When you had a chance to build something good from something terrible, when restoration was possible, even if redemption wasn't guaranteed, you took it, you tried. You put in the work and accepted the risk and trusted that the effort itself had value, regardless of the outcome. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, the effort paid off. Sometimes the impossible happened. Sometimes a community rose from the ashes of injustice. Sometimes people changed and grew and became better than they'd been. Sometimes a wealthy widow found home in a simple frontier valley, and a struggling rancher found purpose in restoration, and a child learned that the world could be made better through honest work and shared commitment. The lights of Willow Ridge glowed behind them as they walked, a constellation of hope against the vast Wyoming night. And somewhere, Elias thought, his grandfather's restless spirit finally found peace, knowing that what was lost had been transformed into something new, something worth the years of grief and the hard work of restoration, something that would endure.